Clara Whitmore stood at the altar in a dress that wasn't hers. Shaking so hard, the borrowed lace trembled against her skin. 19 years old. Sold by a debt her dead father left behind. The man beside her tall, sun-darkened, silent as stone, hadn't looked at her once. Not when the preacher spoke. Not when the ring slid onto her finger like a shackle. She told herself she would not cry. She lied. If this story touches your heart, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this journey travels. The summer of 1878 came to Harrow Creek like a punishment. The sun hammered the earth from a sky so pale it looked bleached of every drop of mercy. The creek that gave the town its name had shrunk to a muddy ribbon, and the cottonwood trees along the main road stood white and brittle, their leaves curled inward like fists. By July, even the dogs had stopped barking. The heat took everything: ambition, appetite, patience, and left behind only the hard business of surviving until nightfall. It was in the middle of that brutal summer that Clara Whitmore became a wife. She was 19 years old. She had brown hair the color of creek mud eyes, the color of creek water, and hands roughened from 2 years of washing other women's laundry in a town that never once thanked her for it. She was not beautiful in the way the merchants' daughters were beautiful. She had no silk ribbons, no parasol, no father to stand behind her and make men behave. What she had was a straight spine and a jaw that didn't tremble, and she held on to both of those things like weapons as she stood inside the whitewashed walls of the Harrow Creek Baptist Church and waited for her life to be handed to someone else, her father. Thomas Whitmore had died 14 months ago, owing $340 to a man named Gerald Holt, the largest landowner between Harrow Creek and the Wyoming border. Gerald Holt was not a cruel man in the way that stories require villains to be cruel. He was simply a man who believed that debts should be paid, that the world ran on contracts and consequences, and that sentiment had no place in business. When Thomas Whitmore's heart gave out in the middle of plowing a field he didn't own, Gerald Holt had appeared at Clara's door with the note her father had signed 3 witnesses at his back, and a proposition Clara had no power to refuse. She could work off the debt herself, 7 years of domestic service on the Holt property starting immediately. Or she could marry Holt's nephew Ethan Blackwood, settle the debt in a single stroke, and be done with it. "He needs a wife," Gerald Holt had said, standing on Clara's porch with his hat in his hand and no apology in his voice. "He won't bother you. He lives up in the mountains, mostly keeps to himself. You'd have a roof and a name and food on the table. There are worse arrangements, Miss Whitmore." Clara had looked at the note with her father's signature on it, his cramped, hopeful handwriting. The handwriting of a man who had always believed the next season would be better, and she had felt something inside her chest go very quiet and very cold. "When?" she had asked. 3 weeks, said Gerald Holt. And that had been that. She had not met Ethan Blackwood before the morning of the wedding. This was the detail that stayed with her in the weeks between Gerald Holt's visit and the ceremony itself. Not the debt, not the lost years of her life, not even the way her neighbors had looked at her when word got around, that particular look that managed to combine pity and satisfaction in a way that made her stomach turn. What she could not stop thinking about was that she was going to marry a man she had never seen. She'd heard things about him, of course. Harrow Creek was a small town, and Ethan Blackwood had lived near enough to it, long enough for stories to accumulate the way dust accumulated on windowsills, quietly, steadily, until one day you looked and there was a thick gray layer you couldn't remember arriving. They called him the Wolf Man, which was not his name, but had become his reputation. He had lived alone up in the Blackwood Range, named apparently for his own family generations back for nearly a decade. He came down to Harrow Creek 4 or 5 times a year, bought what he needed, said less than 10 words to anyone, and went back up. He ran cattle on land that was mostly rock and pitch pine and summer wind. He didn't drink at the saloon. He didn't play cards. He didn't court anyone. A woman named Phyllis Garrett, who took in boarders and knew everything, had told Clara over the wash basin 2 months before that Ethan Blackwood had once had a wife years ago, and that the wife had died, and that something in him had died with her. "He's not mean," Phyllis had said, wringing out a shirt with her thick red hands. "I'll say that for him. But he's not warm either. He's like the mountains up there, just endures, just stands. You can't talk to a mountain, honey." Clara had said nothing. She'd kept wringing laundry. What was there to say? On the morning of the wedding, she put on a dress that had belonged to Phyllis Garrett's younger sister, cream-colored years out of fashion, the waist let out, and the hem taken up buttons that didn't quite match. Phyllis had pressed it herself and told Clara she looked lovely. And Clara had stood in front of the small mirror above Phyllis's washstand and looked at herself and thought, "This is not how I imagined this day." She had not imagined the day much. Dreams of that nature had always seemed to her like something other girls were allowed to have, girls with fathers who were still alive, girls with money, girls who had options. Clara had spent most of her life being practical. You worked with what you had. You didn't spend energy longing for what you couldn't reach. But standing in that borrowed dress with pins still holding the bodice together at the back, she allowed herself just for a moment to feel the full weight of what was happening. She was going to marry a stranger. She was going to leave the town she had grown up in, mean and small and unkind as it was, and go up into the mountains with a man who spoke to no one and lived like a wolf, and had not thought her important enough to come and introduce himself even once in 3 weeks. She breathed in through her nose. She breathed out through her mouth. She picked up the small bunch of wildflowers that Phyllis had cut from her own yard that morning and tied with a bit of cotton twine. Then she walked to the church. The church was full. This surprised her. She had expected maybe a dozen people, Gerald Holt and his family, the preacher, a few curious onlookers. Instead, the pews were packed, every face in town turned toward her as she came through the door. The heat inside was extraordinary. All those bodies in that small space, and the air smelled of talcum powder and wood polish, and underneath both of those, the sharp salt smell of sweat. She walked down the aisle alone. There was no one to give her away. She had thought about this, and decided it didn't matter, she wasn't being given. She was paying a debt. Those were different things. She held her wildflowers in both hands, and she looked straight ahead, and she did not let her eyes fill. Ethan Blackwood was standing at the front of the church. She saw him for the first time from 20 feet away, and then 15, and then 10, and then she was standing beside him, and he was not what she had expected, though she hadn't known what she was expecting. He was tall, broad through the chest and shoulders in a way that suggested not a gym or a corset boning, but real work years of it, the kind of body built by hauling timber and wrestling cattle and sleeping on cold ground. His hair was dark brown and cut without much attention to fashion. His jaw was angular and rough with a close-cut beard, his skin the deep reddish brown of someone who spent his days in high-altitude sun. He wore a dark coat she suspected he didn't own any other time of year, and it fit him imperfectly across the shoulders, just slightly too small. He turned to look at her when she reached the altar. His eyes were brown so dark they were nearly black, and they held for a fraction of a second an expression she couldn't read. Not cruelty, not anticipation. Something more complicated than either. Then he turned back to face the preacher, and the expression was gone. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Clara knew because she counted. She counted the minutes the way she used to count steps when she was very small and frightened of the dark. 1, 2, 3. Just get to the next number. The next number is something you can manage. She repeated her vows in a clear, steady voice, because she refused to give the packed pews behind her the pleasure of hearing her falter. She did not look at Ethan Blackwood's face when she said the words. She looked at the preacher's collar button, which was coming loose on one side. When it was done, Ethan Blackwood turned to her. The preacher said something about the groom kissing the bride. Clara braced herself. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded a single deliberate nod, like a man closing an agreement, and he offered her his arm. He did not kiss her. From somewhere in the pews behind her, someone laughed. The reception was held in the yard behind the church. Gerald Holt's doing. Gerald Holt's spread of cold chicken and summer bread, and 2 pitchers of switchel, and it was there that Clara first began to understand what the next part of her life might look like. She stood with a glass of water in her hand and watched Ethan Blackwood move through the small crowd, and the crowd did what crowds do around men. They are slightly afraid of. They gave him room. He didn't speak much. He shook Gerald Holt's hand. He accepted a piece of bread that someone's wife pressed on him. He answered questions in as few words as he could manage and moved on before the conversation could develop into anything. He did not come to where she was standing. She told herself this was fine. She told herself she had not expected anything different. "Well," said a woman beside her, Sandra Pruitt, whose husband ran the dry goods store, whose nose had been pointed in Clara's direction with mild contempt since the day Thomas Whitmore's debts became public knowledge. "I suppose this is the best a girl in your situation could hope for." Clara looked at her. "A roof," Sandra continued pleasantly. "Food. A name. Most girls in your position end up worse off than this." "Is that so?" said Clara. "He's odd, of course. Everyone knows that. But odd is better than cruel, I always say." Sandra tilted her head slightly. "You'll have to manage him is the thing. Men like that need managing. Keep the house clean, don't ask too many questions, stay out of his way. You can have a decent enough life if you're sensible about it." Clara took a slow sip of her water. "Thank you," she said in a tone that conveyed no gratitude whatsoever, for the advice. Sandra Pruitt opened her mouth to say something else. She didn't get the chance because at that moment Ethan Blackwood appeared out of the crowd at Clara's left side, holding his hat and said, "The wagon's ready." He wasn't looking at Sandra Pruitt. He was looking at Clara, and there was something in his expression, just a flicker quickly controlled, that made Clara wonder if he had been standing close enough to hear. "All right," she said. She set down her water glass. She picked up the small bundle she'd brought everything she owned that was worth keeping wrapped in a cloth and tied with rope. She did not say goodbye to Sandra Pruitt. She followed her husband through the crowd and out to the road where a solid bay horse was hitched to a flatbed wagon. He helped her up onto the seat. His hand was very large and very rough, and he let go the instant she was settled, stepped back, and went around to the other side. They drove out of Harrow Creek in silence. Clara looked straight ahead at the road, at the bleached hills rolling up toward the dark green line of the mountains, at the sky that was too bright and too blue and completely indifferent to anything that happened beneath it. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry, and she was a woman who kept her promises, and she counted that for something. The drive up into the mountains took the better part of 4 hours. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. The road climbed steadily first through scrubland pale and prickly, then through stands of aspen that shivered in the high wind, even in the dead heat of summer, their leaves catching the light in ways that made them look like they were sending signals to someone. The wagon rocked and jolted. The bay horse, a big steady animal named Drum, according to the name Ethan had said once while gathering the reins, moved at a reliable walk that ate up the miles without complaint. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and watched the land change. She had lived her whole life in Harrow Creek's flat valley. She had never been up into the mountains. It was stranger than she'd imagined. Bigger, quieter, more itself. The trees up here were serious trees. The rocks were serious rocks. Nothing up here was decorative. Everything existed because it had earned the right to exist in that particular spot through some long negotiation with weather and altitude and time. She found unexpectedly that she didn't hate it. "You don't have to be afraid of me." She turned. Ethan Blackwood was looking at the road, his hands easy on the reins, his voice flat and matter-of-fact, as if he were commenting on the weather. "I'm not afraid of you," Clara said, which was only partly true. "Most people are," he said. "I'm used to it." "I'm not most people." He glanced at her, then briefly just a turn of his head, and she couldn't tell if the thing in his expression was skepticism or something else. "No," he said after a moment. "Reckon you're not." And then he didn't say anything else for another 2 hours, and Clara found to her own surprise that the silence was not as terrible as she'd expected it to be. The ranch Blackwood Ranch, though there was no sign that said so, sat at the end of a road that stopped being a road about a mile before you reached it and became instead a series of intentions in the dirt that a horse and wagon could navigate if the horse was sensible and the driver knew the way. It was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something dark, something forbidding. A homestead that looked like the man who inhabited it, sealed off angular set against the world. What she found was a low log house with a wide porch, a barn that was worn but solid. A small kitchen garden that someone was actually tending. The rows were straight. The weeds were pulled, and beyond the barn, a pasture where a dozen horses stood in the long summer evening light, heads down, tails swishing. Mountains rose on three sides, dark with pine and spruce, streaked here and there with pale granite. The air was 20 degrees cooler than Harrow Creek and smelled of pine resin and horse and something green she couldn't name. A large gray dog appeared from around the side of the barn, regarded her with calm yellow eyes, and then sat down about 10 feet away and watched. "That's Chess," said Ethan, climbing down from the wagon. "He'll leave you alone unless you want him not to." Clara climbed down herself without waiting to be helped. "What does he do if I want him not to leave me alone?" "He follows you, everywhere." A beat. "He's not subtle." This was, she realized, a joke. Delivered without any change in expression, but a joke nonetheless. She looked at the dog. The dog looked at her. His tail moved once carefully, as if he were reserving judgment but keeping options open. "Hello, Chess," she said. The tail moved again. Ethan carried her bundle and 2 supply crates from the wagon bed and went inside without further ceremony. Clara stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the mountains, feeling the cool air move across her face. She breathed in. She breathed out. Then she followed her husband into the house. The inside of the house was clean in the way that a place gets clean when someone has made a deliberate and somewhat self-conscious effort. Not the deep clean of someone with domestic pride, but the clean of someone who has recently thought about how a space might appear to someone seeing it for the first time. The floor had been swept. The table had been wiped down. There were no dishes in the basin, no dirty clothes on the floor. He had prepared for her arrival. In some small way, he had thought about what she would see when she walked through the door. She noted this. There was a main room with a table and 2 chairs and a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a wood stove and open shelving, and a short hallway beyond. Ethan set her bundle down on the table, then walked to the hallway and indicated a door on the left. "That's your room," he said. She looked at him. "Mine's at the end," he added. "There's a bolt on your door, inside." A pause. She wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. "A bolt. On the inside," he repeated. "So you can lock it, from inside." He said it simply, like a man stating a fact about the geography of the house. There was no performance in it, no implication that he expected gratitude or that he wanted her to remark on it. He was telling her how the house worked, and this was a feature of the house. Clara stood very still. Something in her chest moved in a way that she wasn't prepared for and didn't entirely understand. Not warmth, not yet. It was more like the particular sensation of bracing for a blow that doesn't come. Your whole body has been expecting impact, and when the impact doesn't arrive, it takes a moment for your muscles to understand they can release. "All right," she said when she could trust her voice. "Kitchen's got most of what you need," he said, moving back toward the main room. "I can show you in the morning. There's a pump around the back of the house." He picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it. "I'll put Drum up. You should eat something. I left bread and cold venison on the bottom shelf." "You don't need to," she started. "You haven't eaten since this morning," he said. Not a question. He was right. She hadn't. The reception food had seemed impossible to touch under Sandra Pruitt's eyes and the eyes of everyone else who had come to watch the transaction complete itself. "I'll eat," she said. He nodded. He put his hat on. He went back outside. Clara stood alone in the main room of her new house and listened to his boots cross the porch and the soft scrape of Chess's paws following behind him. and she looked at the door on the left side of the hallway. A bolt on the inside. She walked to it. She opened it. The room was small: a bed, a wooden chest, a window with cotton curtain but clean, and someone had put a blue crockery jug with a handful of wild columbine on the top of the chest. The flowers were purple and yellow, and they had probably been picked that morning because they were still fresh. Wild flowers. She stood in the doorway and looked at the flowers in the blue jug, and she thought, "You don't have to be afraid of me." And she thought about a man who had driven down to Harrow Creek for a wedding he clearly hadn't wanted, and driven back up to these mountains for a marriage he hadn't asked for either, and had in the intervening time found time to pick wildflowers and put them in a jug in a room that had a bolt on the inside. She thought, "I don't know what kind of man you are." She thought, "But I think I am going to have to find out." She found the bread and the cold venison where he'd said they'd be. She ate standing at the kitchen shelf, looking out the small window above it at the darkening shapes of the mountains. The food was simple, and she was hungry, and it was without question the best meal she'd eaten in weeks. She washed her hands and face at the basin. She changed out of Phyllis Garrett's borrowed dress carefully in case she ever needed to return it in decent condition, and put on her own plain cotton nightgown. She went to the room with the bolt on the door. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while. Through the wall, eventually she heard the sound of boots on the porch again, and then the door, and then the quiet sounds of a man at the end of a long day, the clink of a pump handle, the soft thud of boots being set aside, a chair scraping back. She heard no raised voices, no anger, nothing that made her pulse climb, only the ordinary sounds of a person existing in a space. She lay down. She listened to the wind come down off the mountain and press against the window glass. She reached over and slid the bolt into place. Then she lay back and stared at the ceiling and thought about the purple and yellow flowers in the blue jug, and about 11 minutes of vows counted like steps in the dark, and about the fact that she was now legally and completely Mrs. Ethan Blackwood, a woman married to a stranger on a mountain she had never seen before today. She thought, "I don't know what happens next." She thought, "But I am still here. I am still me. That is not nothing." Outside, the mountains sat in the darkness, enduring as they always had. And Clara Whitmore, Clara Blackwood now, though she wasn't ready for that name yet, closed her eyes and eventually slept. She woke before dawn, not because anything had disturbed her, no sound, no movement, nothing she could point to and name. She simply opened her eyes in the darkness of an unfamiliar room and knew with the particular certainty of a body that had spent years sleeping light that she was in a place that was not home. Then she remembered. It all came back in a single quiet wave. The church, the 11 minutes, the wagon road up into the mountains, the bolt on the inside of the door. She lay still for a moment and listened. The house was quiet. Through the wall, nothing, no snoring, no movement. No sign that anyone else existed in the world at all. Outside, the wind had died, and the dark was the specific dark of high altitude, deeper and more absolute than anything she'd known in the valley. She had the sensation briefly of floating somewhere untethered from everything she'd ever known, and she pushed the sensation down and sat up. She dressed in the dark, cotton blouse, worn skirt, her own boots. Not Phyllis Garrett's dress, not borrowed anything, her own things. She pulled her hair back and pinned it without a mirror, and she was satisfied with this because she had been doing it without a mirror for years. She unbolted the door. The main room was empty and gray, in the pre-dawn everything holding its shape without color. She found the wood stove by feel more than sight, found the small pile of split kindling beside it, and had a fire going in the time it would have taken most women to find the matches. She had been lighting fires since she was 9 years old. She filled the kettle from the pump out back, the cold of the pump handle shocking in the morning air. The water so cold, it made her teeth ache, and she set it on the stove. And she stood there in the warming kitchen, and she thought, "All right, this is the first morning. Start as you mean to go on." She had found the coffee the night before. She measured it out. She found a pan and the lard, and what turned out to be a cloth-wrapped portion of salt pork on the lower shelf. She had a reasonable breakfast underway by the time she heard boots in the hallway. Ethan Blackwood stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at her. She looked back at him. He was dressed already. She suspected he had been up before her or had not slept at all, and his expression was the same unreadable set of angles it had been the day before. He looked at the stove. He looked at the pan. He looked at the coffee. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down." A pause. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite catch. He sat down. She put coffee in front of him, and then salt pork and cornbread. She'd found the cornmeal and put it together by memory, the way her mother had taught her, and she sat down across from him with her own plate, and she ate and he ate, and neither of them said anything for a long time. "It's good," he said finally, meaning the food. He said it quietly, like a man who doesn't say such things often, and is slightly uncomfortable saying them now. "Thank you," said Clara. The silence resumed, but it was a different silence than the one in the wagon. Not the silence of two strangers who have nothing to say to each other, but something slightly less empty than that. A silence with the faintest suggestion of shape. When he finished, he put his plate in the basin and picked up his hat. "I'll be at the barn most of the morning. You can—" He stopped, started again. "The house is yours. Do whatever you want with it." "What needs doing?" she asked. He turned. "What?" "On the ranch. What needs doing today?" He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at weather systems coming in over the mountains, assessing, not alarmed, waiting for more information. "You're not—" he started. "I am not going to sit in this house and wait to be told I can exist," Clara said, and her voice was calm and entirely firm. "I grew up working. I intend to keep working. So tell me what needs doing or I'll find it myself, and I may find it in the wrong order." Another pause. His jaw moved slightly, not quite a smile, not quite, not one. "The kitchen garden needs water," he said finally. "The mare in the third stall is due to foal in the next week or so. She'll need checking on. And the fence along the east pasture has a section that keeps coming loose." He paused. "I was going to do the fence." "I can water the garden and check the mare," she said. "You know horses." "I know enough." He studied her for a moment longer. Then he put his hat on his head, touched the brim, an abbreviated automatic gesture that she suspected he made without thinking, and went out. Clara cleared the table. She felt something in her chest that wasn't happiness exactly, but was adjacent to it. Something that felt like standing on ground that might hold your weight, and discovering that it does. The mare's name was Bess, and she was enormous and brown, and had the expression of a woman who had been pregnant in July before and was not charmed by the experience. Clara spent an hour with her that first morning, talking low and moving slow, and learning what Bess would tolerate and what she wouldn't. Bess had opinions. She communicated them clearly. Clara respected this and adjusted accordingly. By the time she left the stall, Bess had permitted Clara to check her over, had accepted a handful of dried apple from Clara's pocket. She'd found them on the kitchen shelf and taken them on instinct, and had given Clara one long, measured look that seemed to communicate something like provisional acceptance, pending further evidence. Chess the dog had followed her to the barn. He sat outside the stall door the whole time, watching his great gray head resting on his paws. "You're a very serious dog," Clara told him. He blinked. "All right," she said. "We understand each other." She did the garden after that. Then she found the loose section of east pasture fence. She found it by following the fence line until she found the place where it obviously wasn't doing its job, and she wasn't able to fix it because she didn't have the tools and didn't know where they were. But she examined it carefully, and she knew what it needed, and she walked back to find Ethan with that information. He was at the far end of the barn working on something with a piece of tack. He looked up when she came in. "East fence," she said. "Third post from the big boulder is rotted at the base. The wire's pulling loose from it. You need a new post, not just the wire restrung." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know that?" "Because I looked at it," she said. "My father had a fence like that once. He kept restringing the wire and the post kept pulling loose. Took him 2 seasons to admit the post was the problem." Something shifted in Ethan's face, a slight adjustment barely visible. "I'll get a post," he said. "I can help set it," she said. If you'll show me how. He looked at her for what felt like a long time. Not hostility, she was beginning to understand that his silences were not hostile, that they were simply the way he processed information. The way some men talked their way through things, and Ethan Blackwood thought his way through them instead, quietly and thoroughly. After the noon meal, he said. She nodded and went back to the house. She did not allow herself to feel pleased about this. She told herself it was simply a practical arrangement between two people who were going to share a working property. Practicality. That was all. But she found herself back in the kitchen, almost smiling, and she pressed her lips together and concentrated on the beans she was sorting. It was the third day when she found the grave. She hadn't been looking for it. She had been walking the property's perimeter, learning it, mapping it in her mind the way she had always mapped the places she needed to understand when she came to the small flat clearing in the trees above the house, the one with the view down across the whole valley, and she saw the wooden marker. It wasn't elaborate. A plank of wood sanded smooth with letters carved into it with careful, unpracticed effort, not the work of someone who carved often, but the work of someone who had wanted to do it right regardless. Ruth Eleanor Blackwood, beloved. 1871. Clara stood very still. She did the arithmetic without meaning to. 1871 was 7 years ago, and Blackwood Ranch, from what she'd seen of it, bore the marks of a man who had lived alone in it for roughly that length of time, not neglected, not falling apart, but quietly, steadily maintained by a single pair of hands, with no particular reason to make it more than functional. She looked at the grave for a long moment. Then she looked at the view. It faced the whole wide valley, going golden in the afternoon light, the mountains holding the world together at its edges. And she thought about a man who had chosen this spot for exactly that reason, and who came up here sometimes probably, and stood where she was standing now. She left without touching anything. She didn't mention it. But that evening when Ethan came in for supper, and she watched him sit down at the table and take his hat off and set it in the same place he always set it, she found that something in the way she looked at him had changed. Not pity. She didn't think he'd want pity. But something. Understanding, she thought. Maybe just that. 2 weeks in, she was watering the kitchen garden when she heard the sound of a horse coming up the road fast. She straightened and turned, and the rider who came into the yard was a boy, maybe 15, maybe 16, dusty from a hard ride, and breathing like he'd been scared into a gallop. "Mr. Blackwood?" the boy called out, pulling up his horse and looking at Clara with some confusion. "I need Mr. Blackwood." "He's in the barn," Clara said. "What's happened?" "There's men on the lower road," the boy said. "3 of 'em. They stopped my uncle's wagon and took his supply money. Wouldn't let him pass till he paid 'em. My uncle sent me up. He said Mr. Blackwood would want to know." Clara walked to the barn door. Ethan. He was at her side in 30 seconds, and 2 minutes after that, he had Drum saddled and was swinging up. He looked down at Clara from the saddle, and she could see something in his face that was different from the ordinary set of it, not rage, but its controlled cousin. A very deliberate, very quiet kind of anger. "Stay here," he said. "I know," she said. She looked up at him. "Be careful." He looked at her for a moment. Then he touched his hat brim and rode. She stood in the yard with Chess at her side and watched him go, and she felt the particular quality of waiting that she had never quite felt before. Not the waiting of someone who has no stake in the outcome, but the waiting of someone who does. When he came back 2 hours later with the 3 men roped together behind his horse and the boy's uncle's supply money in a cloth pouch that he handed to the boy without ceremony, she was still in the yard. She had not been able to make herself go inside. He dismounted and looked at her. She looked at him. "You waited," he said. "I told you to be careful," she said. "I needed to know if you listened." Something happened in his expression, then a crack in the granite, brief and unmistakable. Not a smile quite, but something close enough to one that she felt it in her own chest. "I'll take these men to the sheriff in the morning," he said. "Can you?" "I'll get them water and something to eat," she said. "Roped men still need feeding." He blinked. "Don't look so surprised," she said, and turned back to the house. Behind her, she thought she heard him exhale not quite a laugh, but something in the neighborhood of one. The first time she heard him actually laugh, was on the 17th day. She had been trying to learn to ride properly. Ethan had offered in his oblique way to teach her, "You'll need to get up and down the mountain on your own sometime. No point being stuck." If something happens, and she had accepted, and they had been working in the small paddock behind the barn every other morning, with a gray mare named Opal, who was patient and sensible, and clearly the smartest individual on the property. Clara was not afraid of horses, but she had only ever ridden bareback on her father's old plow horse, which was not what anyone would call formal equestrian training. Learning proper seat and rein, and the particular balance that Ethan was trying to describe, not gripping, not bracing, just settling. Like you're telling the horse you're not going anywhere, and neither are they. Was harder than she'd expected, and she was not accustomed to things being harder than expected. On the 17th day, she had been doing reasonably well. Opal had been cooperative. She had begun to feel the thing Ethan was describing, that sense of weight settling rather than clutching, and she had felt briefly like she was getting it. Then a rabbit burst out of the grass at the paddock's edge. Opal shied sideways. Clara, who had been settling so beautifully completely, forgot to settle and grabbed the saddle horn and overcorrected and ended up in the dust of the paddock on her backside, looking up at the summer sky with an expression of profound indignation. She heard it. She actually heard it, a sound from the fence post where Ethan was standing that was short and low and completely involuntary, the sound of a man whose self-control has been briefly and thoroughly overridden by amusement. She turned her head and looked at him. He had both hands on the top fence rail, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Open, unguarded, a brightness in his eyes that transformed him so entirely that for a moment she didn't quite recognize him. "If you laugh at me," she said from the dirt, "I will put salt in your coffee for a week." The laugh escaped again, more fully this time, and he pressed his lips together and looked away, and then looked back, and the corners of his eyes were creased, and he was trying very hard to be serious and failing completely. She sat up and pulled a piece of grass out of her hair. "Opal," she said to the horse, who had stopped 3 feet away and was regarding her with gentle concern, "you are a traitor." Opal blinked. Ethan had come around the fence by then, and he offered his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet, and for a moment they were very close. Her hand in his. Both of them in the dust and the summer heat, and the brightness in his eyes was still there close up, and she realized she hadn't known his eyes could look like that. She stepped back and brushed off her skirt. "Again," she said. "You don't have to." "Again," she said. Something in his face went soft with something she had no word for yet. "Again," he agreed. On the 23rd day she made a mistake. She had been going through the small wooden crate she kept her personal things and the few things she'd brought from Harrow Creek, letters from her father written before the debt got bad, a small photograph of her mother, a piece of ribbon she'd kept since childhood, for no reason she could explain. At the bottom of the crate, folded very small, was the letter Gerald Holt had given her with the terms of the arrangement. She'd kept it because she'd thought she might need it, though she'd never read it through more than once. She unfolded it that morning, sitting on the edge of her bed, and she read it through again. The language was what she expected: debt settlement transfer of obligation. The name Thomas Whitmore, the sum of $340. But at the bottom of the letter below, Gerald Holt's signature, was a clause she had not looked at carefully before, or had not understood in the way she understood it now. In the event that the union proves untenable to either party within the first year of the arrangement, Mr. Blackwood retains the right to dissolve the agreement and return Miss Whitmore to Harrow Creek, at which point the original debt shall be considered reinstated in full. She sat with this for a long time. He retained the right. That was the language. Gerald Holt presumably had written it as a protection for his nephew Ethan could end this if he wanted to send her back, and the debt would be hers again. Hers alone, with no father left to be responsible for it, no way to pay it, no recourse. She was not legally functionally any more secure than she had been before. She folded the letter up and put it back in the crate and sat there a moment longer, and she was not going to tell herself she hadn't known this. She had known this. She just hadn't thought about it clearly in some time, and thinking about it clearly now made the ground feel less solid than it had this morning. Then she put the crate away, stood up and went to start the noon meal. This was what you did. You stood up and you got on with it. But something had shifted. A new awareness, not of danger exactly, but of precarity. Of the fact that the thing she was building here, the quiet routines and the morning coffee and the fence posts and Opal in the paddock, and even, she admitted to herself, the particular way Ethan Blackwood's face looked when something surprised him into openness, none of it was guaranteed. None of it was hers. She put the beans on, and she didn't say anything. Ciao. That afternoon, Ethan found her at the kitchen table with her, sewing a tear in one of his shirts she'd noticed, and taken without asking, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before he said, "Something wrong?" She looked up. No. He came in and poured himself a cup of coffee cold from that morning and leaned against the counter. He was watching her. She had learned that he watched things carefully, that he noticed details that most people didn't bother to notice, and she found this was something she needed to factor in when dealing with him. "You've been quiet," he said. "I'm often quiet." Different kind of quiet today. She set the shirt down. She considered telling him it was nothing she was good at, that had been good at it her whole life, the deflection and the redirect and the "I'm fine" that required nothing from anyone. She considered it seriously. Then she thought about the letter in the crate and about the word untenable and about what it would mean to manage this alone. "I read the letter again," she said. "Holt's letter, the terms." He was very still. "I understand the arrangement," she said carefully. "I understand what you retain the right to do. I'm not asking you about it. I just wanted you to know that I know." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Ethan set down his coffee. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. When he looked up, something in his expression was more open than she'd ever seen it. Not the brief crack of amusement, but something more intentional, more effortful, like a man opening a door he's kept shut for a very long time. "I didn't write that clause," he said. "I know. Gerald Holt did. I didn't ask for it." He paused. "I told him I didn't want it. He put it in anyway. Said it was—" Another pause. "Prudent." Clara said nothing. She was listening to everything, the words and the spaces between them. "I'm not going to use it," he said. His voice was flat. Not without feeling. She had learned to hear the feeling in his flat voice, but very certain. The certainty of a man making a statement of fact. "That's not what this is." "What is it?" she asked. The question sat in the kitchen between them. He picked up his coffee again. He didn't drink it. He looked at the window above the basin, at the light coming through it. "I don't know yet," he said finally. "But it's not that." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the shirt again and the needle and found her place in the seam. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated. "I believe you," she said simply, and returned to her sewing. She did not see his face then, but she heard after a moment the quiet sound of him pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down, and when she glanced up, he was sitting there with his coffee and his hands around the cup, and his eyes on the middle distance, and he did not leave for a very long time. The fourth week began with a problem. Ethan came to breakfast that morning tight-jawed and short of word, which was not unusual except that the quality of it was different. Not the ordinary quiet, but something brittle underneath something being held together by force of will. He drank his coffee standing up, which he never did, and he told her he was going to ride the perimeter of the upper pasture, and he might not be back by noon. "Has something happened?" she asked. "Water problem," he said. "The upper spring's been running low. I need to see how low." Clara knew enough about ranch life to know what a water problem in summer could mean. Her father's land had dried up one terrible summer when she was 12, and she remembered the way everything had gone wrong in sequence, The crops first, then the stock, then the money, then the man himself. A water problem was not a small problem. A water problem was a beginning. "What can I do?" she said. He looked at her. "Nothing yet. I need to see the situation first." He went. She did the morning's work and found herself unable to settle into any of it properly, checking the yard more than she needed to, the way she'd done the night he'd gone to deal with the men on the road. She recognized this in herself and didn't particularly like it. She told herself it was practical concern. A struggling ranch was a concern for both of them, and she was not entirely lying to herself. He came back at mid-afternoon. He came in without speaking and poured water from the jug and drank it standing at the counter, his back to her, and she watched his back and waited. "It's worse than I thought," he said. "Tell me." He turned around. He sat down at the table. She sat across from him, and he told her the upper spring that fed the pasture trough was running at less than a quarter its normal output, and the lower creek that watered the kitchen garden and the animals near the barn was following the same direction, and if the summer stayed as dry as it was by August, they'd be hauling water by the barrel from the river 4 miles down the mountain, and the cost of that in time and labor was significant enough that it would affect everything else. "There's a man," Ethan said slowly, "in Harrow Creek. Name of Aldous Crane. He owns the property that borders mine on the north side. The boundary runs right through the place where that upper spring starts, and about 3 years ago Crane started diverting." Clara was quiet. "Not much," Ethan said. "A little. Enough, I noticed, but not enough to take to a judge because judges in this county tend to see what Crane wants them to see. He's got money. I don't. In this county, that's most of the argument." "What has he diverted it to?" Clara asked. "New barn. Second pasture he's developing." Ethan's jaw was set. "He doesn't need more water than he's got naturally. He's just building, expanding, taking what he can take because he can take it." Clara thought about this. "Is there another source on your property?" "There's a wet area in the upper timber that I've always figured for a seep. I've never developed it because the spring was enough." He paused. "I'd need to dig and shore it up properly and figure out how to pipe it down, and I've been putting it off because it's a significant job, and the spring was enough." "Until now," Clara said. "Until now." He agreed. She sat with it. She turned it over. She had discovered about herself in the past weeks a person who needed to think about problems rather than immediately react to them, and she had learned that Ethan was the same. And this was one of the quiet ways in which they had begun to work together, in that they could sit with a problem in companionable silence without either of them feeling obligated to fill the silence with noise. "We dig the seep," she said finally. "It's weeks of work." "So it's weeks of work." "Clara," he said, and then stopped. He almost never used her name. The sound of it in his voice did something unexpected to the inside of her chest. "You didn't sign on for—" "I signed on for this ranch," she said. "Whatever that means." He looked at her across the table. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table between them and outside. The wind moved through the pine trees, and Chess shifted in his spot on the porch. And Ethan Blackwood looked at his wife the way a man looks at something he has been expecting to be temporary and is beginning to suspect might not be. "I need to go to Harrow Creek," he said at last. "Talk to a man about pipe fittings. Day after tomorrow." "I'll come with you," she said. He didn't say no. She took that for what it was. They went down the mountain on a Thursday morning, Drum pulling the flatbed with both of them on the seat. The road was hot and dry, and the valley was shimmering when they reached the flat, and Harrow Creek rose up out of the scrub, just as it always had, just as small and tight and full of its own opinions about itself. The first half hour went without incident. Ethan got what he needed at the hardware. Clara went to the dry goods store for thread and salt, and a few things she'd noted the kitchen was running short on. She paid with money from the small household fund Ethan had set up, without commentary, which she'd been managing with the thrift of someone who had grown up understanding exactly what money meant. She was coming out of the dry goods store when she nearly walked into Sandra Pruitt. Sandra Pruitt stopped dead on the wooden walkway and looked at her. Clara stopped too. "Well," said Sandra. "Clara Whitmore, still up there on that mountain." "Clara Blackwood," Clara said pleasantly. Sandra's smile had the quality of a knife that's trying to look like a spoon. "Of course. Forgive me." She looked Clara over, took in the clean dress, the straight spine, the absence of anything that might be construed as suffering, and her smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes recalculated. "How are you finding it up there? All alone with him?" "We manage," Clara said. "He must be—" Sandra paused, choosing. "Difficult to live with. A man like that." "A man like what?" Clara said. Sandra blinked. "Well, odd, closed off. You know what people say." "I know what people say," Clara agreed. "People say a lot of things. They're frequently wrong." She stepped around Sandra and was walking toward the wagon when she heard Sandra's voice behind her, louder now, pitched for the benefit of the three women standing outside the millinery who had been watching the exchange with avid attention. "I'm sure it can't be what she imagined for herself. A girl like that? Married off like she was. You do what you have to do, I suppose." Clara stopped. She turned around slowly. The three women outside the millinery were watching. A man coming out of the saloon had paused. The street had done what small-town streets do when something is about to happen, held its breath. She could feel the eyes. She could feel the familiar pull of the old shame. The debt, the marriage, the girl like that, a whole life reduced to a transaction in the eyes of people who had never once considered what it might cost. She looked at Sandra Pruitt. She opened her mouth, and then she heard boots on the wooden walkway behind her, and Ethan Blackwood walked past her and stopped between her and Sandra Pruitt, and when he spoke, his voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of voice that required everyone in range to go quiet in order to hear it, and everyone in range did. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said. Sandra Pruitt's smile flickered. "My wife," Ethan said, "came down this mountain today because this is her town as much as it's yours. She's got as much right to this street as anyone on it." His voice stayed level, stayed quiet. "The next time you'd like to say something about her, you'll do it to her face, or you won't say it. That's the only way this is going to work." Sandra Pruitt stared at him. The three women outside the millinery stared at him. The man from the saloon stared at him. Ethan Blackwood touched his hat brim, turned and offered Clara his arm. She took it. She walked with him back to the wagon, and they climbed up and drove out of Harrow Creek the way they'd come in, and the town watched them go, and Clara sat beside her husband with her hands in her lap, and her back very straight, and she did not say anything until they were a mile up the mountain road and the town was behind them. Then she said quietly, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I was going to handle it myself." "I know that too," he said. "But she wasn't talking to you anymore. She was talking about you, in front of people." A pause. "That's different." She looked at him. He was watching the road. His face was its ordinary set of planes and angles, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that she'd learned to read, not quite tension, but its resolution. A man who had done what he intended to do. "You didn't like it," she said, not a question. "No," he said. "The way they talked about it, the wedding, the arrangement." He was quiet. The road climbed. The aspens shivered on either side. "No," he said again, and this time the word held more weight, had more rooms in it. "I didn't like it then either. The way it was set up. What Gerald—" He stopped, started again. "You didn't have a choice. That was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I agreed to it, and I agreed to it anyway because Gerald said you'd be worse off without it, and I don't know if that was true, or if that was just what I needed to hear to go along with something I shouldn't have gone along with." Clara was very still. This was the most he had said to her at once about any personal subject since the morning she'd found the clause in Gerald Holt's letter. It came out of him with the quality of something that had been waiting for a while to be said, not prepared, not rehearsed, just finally said. "You couldn't have known me," she said at last. "No." "You didn't know what I needed or what was best for me." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He looked at her then, just briefly pulling his eyes from the road. "But I know you now. Some. More than I did." He turned back. "And you're—" He paused for a long time. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" she asked. He thought about it. She could see him thinking about it, giving the question the same care he gave to fence posts and water problems and everything else that mattered. "Someone who would manage," he said finally. "Someone who'd get through it. Survive." A pause. "Not someone who'd—" He seemed to run out of words or run out of willingness to use the words he had. "Not someone who'd— what?" she asked. He looked at the road. His jaw moved. "Fix things," he said finally. "Not someone who'd fix things." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the road ahead of them, at the mountain getting bigger and greener as they climbed at the sky going golden toward late afternoon. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Tell me about Ruth." The silence that followed lasted through 2 bends in the road. She didn't push it. She had learned not to push. "She was kind," he said at last. His voice had changed, not broken, not raw, but careful in the way of a man stepping onto ice he knows will hold, but is testing anyway. "She was the kindest person I've ever known. Didn't have a sharp edge on her anywhere." Another pause. "She died because I made a decision about which road to take coming back from Laramie. It was faster. It went through the high pass. She thought it was fine. It wasn't fine." Clara didn't say she was sorry. She could tell he didn't want that. "So you closed," she said instead. "After." "I closed," he agreed. "And now," she said, "you're—" "I don't know what I am," he said with a kind of rough honesty that she thought probably cost him something. "That's the truth. I don't know." She nodded. She folded her hands back in her lap. "All right," she said. "You keep saying that," he said, and there was something almost wondering in it. "Because it keeps being true," she said. The wagon rolled on up the mountain, and the mountains received them the way they always did, steadily, without fanfare, and by the time the ranch came into view, the day was going purple, and the first stars were showing, and Chess was at the gate waiting the way he always was, and Ethan helped Clara down from the wagon, and she went inside to start the fire, and when she came back to the kitchen doorway to call him to supper, he was still standing in the yard, looking up at the sky, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen there before, like a man who has been in a dark room for a very long time, and has just noticed with some surprise a crack of light along the bottom of the door. The seep took 11 days to develop into something worth calling a water source. 11 days of digging in the upper timber in July heat, of hauling pipe fittings up the mountain on drum's back, of figuring out by trial and error, and one significant argument about slope gradient, how to get water to run downhill in the direction they needed it to run. Clara worked beside Ethan every morning from first light until the heat became unreasonable, and then they came back in the afternoon when the shade moved, and she learned things in those 11 days that she had not known she was capable of learning: how to read the ground for moisture, how to seat pipe fittings, how to shore up a channel wall so it wouldn't collapse in the next hard rain. She also learned how Ethan worked. He was methodical. He didn't rush, and he didn't cut corners, and when something didn't work, he stopped and looked at it and thought about why before he tried again. He explained things when she asked, and didn't explain things when she didn't, and he had a way of working alongside someone that made you feel capable rather than supervised. She had worked for other people most of her life, in houses and laundries, in a dry goods store for 6 months when she was 17, and she knew the difference between a person who worked with you and a person who directed you. And Ethan Blackwood worked with her, and this was not a small thing. On the 9th day the water ran. Not much, a thin clear thread of it down the channel they'd built, but it ran, and it was cold, and it was real. And when Clara put her hand in it and felt the cold against her palm, she sat back on her heels and felt something so purely good that she had no word for it. She looked up at Ethan, who was standing over the channel, watching the water move, with an expression that was as close to relief as his face got. "It's running," she said. Unnecessary, but she said it anyway. "It's running," he agreed. They looked at each other across the channel, with the cold water moving between them, and she thought, "We built this." Not he built it. Not she helped. They built it together, two people who 3 months ago had been strangers, and the water was running because of both of them. She looked back at the water before her expression could say too much. The letter from Gerald Holt arrived on a Tuesday, brought up by the same boy who'd ridden to warn them about the men on the road. He made the trip once a week now, carrying mail and occasional supplies from town, and Clara had taken to sending back a small bundle of dried herbs with him for his mother, who had a chest complaint. She recognized Holt's handwriting on the envelope and brought it to Ethan without opening it. He opened it at the kitchen table after supper, read it once, and set it down. His face had gone to its controlled blank, which she had learned was not blankness at all, but its opposite, a face working very hard to contain something. "What does it say?" she asked. He pushed it across the table to her. She read it. She read it again. Gerald Holt was calling in a favor. That was the polite version of what the letter said. The less polite version was that Holt had agreed some years back to a boundary survey with Aldous Crane. The same Crane who'd been diverting the upper spring, and the survey now complete, suggested that a strip of Blackwood land along the northern pasture boundary had been incorrectly recorded in the original deed. Holt had written to inform Ethan of this, in what Holt described as a spirit of transparency, and to let Ethan know that Crane intended to file a legal claim on the strip in question. The strip in question was where they had just spent 11 days building the water channel. Clara read the letter a third time. She set it down. "He knew," she said. Ethan's jaw was tight. "I don't know that." "You know that," she said not unkindly. "Holt has been in business with Crane for years. That's common knowledge in Harrow Creek. He knew about the survey. He sent you this letter now because the channel is finished, and the work is done, and Crane is ready to claim it." "That's not something I can prove," Ethan said. "No," Clara agreed. "But it's true." He got up from the table and stood at the kitchen window. He was very still in the way he was still when something was serious, the stillness of a man gathering himself rather than a man who has nothing to say. "The strip is 40 feet wide," he said. "It runs right through the channel. If Crane gets the claim filed and it goes his way, he doesn't just get the land, he gets the water." "How long does a claim filing take?" Clara asked. "Weeks, maybe longer depending on the judge." He paused. "Depending on how much Crane pays the judge." Clara was quiet. She thought about the water running cold and clear down the channel they'd built. She thought about Ethan's face when it started running. She thought about what a summer without water meant for the pasture, for the horses, for the cattle, for the kitchen garden, for all of it. "Who's the land agent in Harrow Creek?" she asked. "Man named Pettifer. He recorded the original deed." "Is he Crane's man?" Ethan turned from the window. He looked at her carefully. "Why?" "Because if he's not Crane's man, he might have the original survey notes. Before Crane's survey. And if the original survey and Crane's survey don't agree, that's a legal argument." Ethan was looking at her with an expression she was coming to know, the one that happened when she said something that had come out differently than he'd expected. Not surprise exactly. Something more like recalibration. "Pettifer's not Crane's man," he said slowly. "He's his own man. Old, particular. He doesn't like Crane actually. Crane once tried to renegotiate a fee, and Pettifer threw him out of the office." "Then we need to talk to Pettifer," Clara said, "before Crane does." "Clara." "Someone has to move first," she said. "It should be us." He picked up his hat from the table. He looked at it. He put it back down. "I'll ride down tomorrow," he said. "We'll ride down tomorrow," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You keep doing that. You keep giving me openings," she said. And despite everything, the letter Crane, the water, all of it, something in his expression shifted, and for just a moment the weight lifted, and he almost smiled. They rode to Harrow Creek the next morning, before the worst of the heat arrived. Pettifer's land office was on the far end of the main street, past the saloon and the millinery, a narrow building that smelled of paper and old wood and decades of careful record-keeping. Oliver Pettifer was 70 years old, small, and possessed of an expression that suggested he had seen every kind of human dishonesty and was not impressed by any of it. He looked at Ethan when they came in, and he looked at Clara, and he said, "Blackwood, heard you got married." "I did," Ethan said. "This is the one." "This is Clara," Ethan said, which was not precisely an answer to Pettifer's question, but Clara appreciated it anyway. Pettifer looked at her with sharp gray eyes. "You the one who's got him coming down the mountain more than once a season?" "I am," Clara said. Pettifer made a sound that might have been approval. He gestured at the two chairs in front of his desk and went around to his own and lowered himself into it. "Crane's letter," he said before either of them spoke. "I know why you're here. He sent me one too." He folded his hands on the desk. "Smug piece of work, that letter. Congratulating me on the survey results as if I had anything to do with his bought survey." Ethan sat forward. "You know it's bought. I know Crane hired a man from out of county who arrived with the measurements already written in his notebook," Pettifer said dryly. "I've been recording land in this county for 40 years. I know what a survey looks like when the numbers were decided before the measuring." He opened his desk drawer. "I also kept the original survey of the Blackwood North boundary, from 1861, your father's deed." He put a document on the desk. Clara leaned in. "The boundary in my records," Pettifer said, "puts that northern line 14 feet further north than Crane's survey claims, which means the strip he's claiming doesn't exist." He tapped the document. "This is the legal record. His survey is a piece of theater." "Can you hold it?" Ethan asked. "If he files a claim." "He hasn't filed yet," Pettifer said. "He's posturing. He does this makes noise, gets people to settle before it gets to a judge, because most people don't want the trouble and the cost." He looked at Ethan steadily. "You're not most people. You never settled before." "I had less to lose before," Ethan said, and something in his voice when he said it made Clara look at him, and he was looking at the document on the desk, not at her, but she had the sudden and very clear impression that the thing he meant was not only the water channel. "If he files," Pettifer said, "I'll testify. My record's against his bought survey. I've done it before." A pause. "I don't like Crane. He's the sort of man who thinks the valley exists for his convenience. I've watched him take things from people for 20 years, and I've waited for someone with enough to fight back." He looked at both of them. "You've got something worth fighting for now. Don't make me wait another 20 years. Clara looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Pettifer. "We won't?" Ethan said. Crane made his move on a Thursday. Clara was in the kitchen garden when the riders came up the mountain road, 3 of them moving at a pace that wasn't quite aggressive, but wasn't casual either. She recognized Aldous Crane from Harrow Creek, where she had seen him twice, both times, in the company of men who stood slightly behind him, and slightly to the right, which was the particular arrangement of men who expected to be useful. He was a heavy man somewhere in his 50s, red-faced from the altitude and from a general disposition toward being irritated by things that didn't comply with his expectations. She put down her gardening and walked to the porch and stood on it, and Chess came and stood beside her, and she looked at the riders and did not move. Crane pulled up his horse in the yard. He looked at her. He looked around for Ethan, who was not visible, and then looked back at her with the expression of a man who is mildly put out to be dealing with a woman when he came to deal with a man. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said. Not respectfully. The use of the name was more like touching something to check if it was solid. "Mr. Crane," she said. "Your husband, about—" "He'll be here shortly," she said. Which was true. She had seen Ethan cross the yard toward the barn 20 minutes ago, and he could not have gone far. Crane shifted in his saddle. His 2 men sat their horses behind him and looked at nothing in particular. "I've come to discuss a land matter," Crane said. "Formally." "I'm aware of the land matter," Clara said. This seemed to mildly surprise him. "Then you know I'm filing a claim on the north boundary strip." "I know you intend to," she said. "I also know what Oliver Pettifer's original survey says about that boundary. And I suspect you know too, or you'd have filed already instead of riding up here first." Crane looked at her for a moment with an expression that was reassessing its initial assumptions. Pettifer's records are old, he said. Land records get superseded. By legitimate surveys, Clara said, conducted by licensed surveyors, using methods that can be demonstrated. She kept her voice pleasant and her eyes steady. You're welcome to file. We'll welcome the opportunity to let a judge compare the documents. Crane's face had taken on a particular shade of red that had less to do with altitude. I'm offering a settlement, he said. A fair arrangement. Blackwood gives up the North Strip, which is legally mine, and I drop any further claims on the water diversion question. Clara felt this land in her chest like a stone. The water diversion question. He was confirming it right there, confirming that he knew what he'd been doing to the spring, that he'd been doing it deliberately, and that he considered it a bargaining chip. She heard boots on the porch behind her. Ethan came to stand beside her. He took in the yard, Crane, the two men, the horses, in a single sweep, and then he looked at Crane the way Clara imagined he looked at weather that was going to require attention. Crane, he said. Blackwood. Crane tried to recover his footing. As I was telling your wife, I heard you, Ethan said. He had come out through the front door, and Clara realized he must have come in through the back while Crane was talking, had heard at least some of it. The answer is no. Crane's jaw set. You want to take this to a judge, I've got a survey. You've got a performance, Ethan said. His voice was level and quiet, and Crane's two men shifted slightly in their saddles. Pettifer's records go back to my father's deed. His documentation is clean and it's public record. You want to take that to any judge in Wyoming who isn't on your payroll, you're welcome to try. A pause. And while we're talking about records, how many years have you been running a diversion off the North Spring? Because that's documented too. Crane's face went through several colors. I've got water rights. To your own water, Ethan said. Not mine. He stepped off the porch into the yard one step, and it wasn't a threatening move. But it wasn't not one either. He stopped and looked up at Crane on his horse, and the size difference between a mounted man and a standing one did not seem to apply here in the way it usually did. You want to settle this in court, we'll settle it in court. But right now, you're on my land uninvited, and I'd like you to get off it. The silence in the yard had the particular texture of a moment that could go several ways. Then Crane looked at Clara, and something in what he found in her expression, steady, unimpressed, entirely prepared to hold this position indefinitely, seemed to finish his calculation. He gathered his reins. You're making a mistake, he said. Add it to my account, Ethan said. Crane turned his horse and rode. His two men followed without a word, and the sound of the hooves went down the mountain road and faded, and the yard went quiet. Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Ethan turned and looked at her. You talked to him, he said, before I got out here. He arrived while you were in the barn, she said. I wasn't going to stand on my own porch and say nothing. What did you say? I told him we had Pettifer's records, and we'd welcome a judge looking at both surveys. She paused. I may have been slightly more confident about this than the situation strictly warranted. Something happened in his face. Slightly, he repeated. We do have Pettifer's records, she said. That part was accurate. He stood looking at her in the afternoon light with Chess sitting between them, head swiveling back and forth between the two humans, and Ethan shook his head once, not negatively, but with the movement of a man absorbing something. Come inside, he said. We need to write to Pettifer today. She followed him, and as she passed him on the porch, she heard him say quietly, almost to himself, slightly more confident than the situation warranted. Not quite a laugh, but close. Fine. The letter went to Pettifer. Pettifer replied within the week. Crane, as Pettifer had predicted, had not yet filed, and Pettifer's position was that if Crane intended to file, he would have done it immediately, rather than riding up to the ranch to negotiate, which meant the bought survey had problems Crane was aware of. They would wait. They would be ready. In the meantime, the ranch continued its work, which did not pause for legal disputes. Bess foaled on a Tuesday night in the third week of August. Clara had been checking on her twice a day for the past week, and had moved her sleeping schedule accordingly up at midnight, up at 3. A quick lamp-lit check of the third stall back to bed. Ethan had told her she didn't have to, that he'd been through difficult foalings alone before, and Clara had told him that was not the current situation, and he had not pushed back further. It was the 3 of the morning check that caught it. She knew immediately that something was wrong. Bess's distress was a different quality than normal late-stage labor. She was straining and not progressing, and when Clara checked, she found the foal positioned wrong, and her hands were smaller than Ethan's, and she knew that, and she ran. She went through the house without ceremony, knocked once on Ethan's door, and opened it. "Bess," she said. "Now." He was pulling his boots on before she finished the word. They worked in the lamplight of the third stall for the better part of an hour. Ethan's hands and Clara's talking each other through it in low, urgent voices. Bess was exhausted and frightened and trusting them in the particular way animals trust people in extremity completely, with nowhere else to go. And Clara spoke to her steadily the whole time, her hand on Bess's neck, talking about nothing in particular, just her voice in the dark, steady and present. The foal arrived at 4:10 in the morning. It was a filly, dark brown, impossibly thin-legged spectacular. She folded onto the clean straw and blinked in the lamplight, and Bess turned and pushed her nose against her with a sound that was almost human in its exhausted relief. Clara sat back against the stall wall and looked at both of them and felt tears on her face, which she had not realized were happening until they were already there. She wiped them with the back of her hand. Ethan was sitting back against the opposite wall, and when she looked up, he was looking at her rather than at the mare and the foal, and his expression was open in a way she'd only seen a few times before, undefended, present, not working to contain itself. "You talked to her the whole time," he said. His voice was low and a little rough from the night. "She needed to know someone was here," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "She did." Clara looked back at the foal. "What are you going to call her?" Clara asked. "I figured you'd name her," he said, "since you stayed up every night watching for her." Clara looked at the filly, at the way she was already trying her legs, already pushing up, already doing the extraordinary and ordinary work of learning to stand. "June," Clara said, "even though it's August." "Why June?" "Because that's when things start," Clara said. "Not when the calendar says. When they actually start." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "June," he said. And that was that. She found him at the grave for the first time on the last Sunday of August. She had not gone back to the clearing since that first day. She had made a decision, after finding it, that it was his space, his grief, his history, the private geography of a loss she could understand in the abstract, but not from the inside. She had not mentioned it again after the conversation in the wagon. She went up to the timber that morning to check the water channel they'd had 2 days of hard wind, and she wanted to see if any debris had blocked the intake, and she took the wrong fork in the trail without realizing it, and came out into the clearing before she knew where she was. He was standing in front of the wooden marker hat in his hands. She stopped. He heard her. She was not as quiet in the woods as she needed to be, and turned. She expected him to close, expected the face to go flat and the shoulders to go back the full retreat behind the managed exterior. She braced for it. He didn't close. He just looked at her, and then he looked back at the marker, and he said, "She would have liked you." Clara stood very still. "She liked people who didn't waste words," he said. "She couldn't stand the kind of person who talked around things." He turned the hat in his hands. "She would have liked how you are with the horses, with Bess." A pause. "She loved horses." "Tell me something else about her," Clara said quietly. He thought. "She burned everything she tried to cook," he said. And there was something in his voice that was grief and affection braided so tightly together you couldn't separate the strands. "Everything. Every single thing. We ate a lot of charcoal, and pretended it was done on purpose. She thought it was the funniest thing about herself. His voice stayed steady, but his jaw moved. She laughed at herself more than anyone I've ever known. Clara said nothing. She let it sit there in the morning air between them. I blamed myself for 7 years, Ethan said. I probably always will, some part of me. But I've been... He stopped. I've been thinking lately that maybe... Another stop. That maybe you're still here, Clara said softly. And there might be reasons for that. He turned and looked at her directly. His eyes in the morning light were very dark and very present. Yeah, he said. Something like that. She nodded. She looked at the marker and then at him. I'm sorry she's gone, Clara said. Truly, and I'm... She paused and chose her words carefully. I'm glad you told me. He held her gaze for a moment longer than he usually did. Then he looked back at the marker. Go check your channel, he said, but not roughly. I'll be along. She left him there. She found the channel in good order, cleared a handful of sticks from the intake, and was walking back toward the ranch when he caught up with her on the trail. He didn't say anything. He walked beside her, and she walked beside him, and Chess trotted ahead of them both. That was enough. That was plenty. Dud. The blow came without warning, the way the worst things always did. It was a morning in early September, 11 weeks after Clara had arrived on the mountain, and she was at the kitchen table writing a letter to Phyllis Garrett. She wrote to Phyllis once a month, a habit she'd established, partly because Phyllis had been kind to her, and partly because Phyllis knew everything that happened in Harrow Creek, and some of it was useful. She was in the middle of a sentence about June the filly, when she heard horses in the yard and the sound of multiple voices. She went to the door. There were 4 men in the yard. She recognized 2 of them, Aldous Crane, and beside him, Gerald Holt, which made her stomach drop in a way that was more instinctive than rational. Holt had not been up the mountain in the entire time she'd been here. He had not written again after the first letter. His presence now in the company of Crane said everything it needed to say without anyone opening their mouth. The other 2 men she didn't know, but one was carrying a leather case of the type she had seen on lawyers in Harrow Creek, and one had the look of an official, the look of a man carrying paperwork that cost people things. Ethan was already on the porch. He had been inside when she heard the horses. She'd heard him in the main room, and he'd come out ahead of her, and was standing on the porch with the particular stillness that meant he'd already taken in the situation and was deciding how to receive it. Gerald, he said. Not warm, not hostile. Contained. Ethan. Holt had this manner of a man doing something he'd decided was regrettable but necessary, which Clara had always found to be the most irritating manner a person could have. I apologize for arriving without notice. This is it became necessary to move quickly. What is it? Ethan said. Holt gestured to the official-looking man who stepped forward and produced papers from inside his coat. There's a court filing, Holt said. Crane has filed his claim on the north boundary. A judge in Laramie has issued a temporary order. A Laramie judge, Ethan said. Not the county. The county court has a backlog, Crane said. He had the look of a man trying not to appear pleased and not entirely succeeding. The Laramie court was more expedient. Expedient, Ethan said. And more expensive. The temporary order, the official said moving forward, requires that development on the disputed strip be paused pending resolution of the claim. That includes the water infrastructure installed in the... I know what it includes, Ethan said. The official handed him the papers. Ethan took them. He looked at them, not reading in the way of a man unfamiliar with legal language, but scanning in the way of a man who has encountered legal language before and is looking for specifics. Clara stepped forward from the doorway and stood beside Ethan. She did it without thinking the way you step toward something rather than away from it. She was aware of Crane looking at her. She was aware of Holt looking at her in a different way, the way of a man who had decided she was a minor detail and is now adjusting that assessment. You went to Laramie, Ethan said to Crane, with your bought survey. My legitimate survey, Crane said, which contradicts the county records Pettifer's been keeping for 40 years. Pettifer is an old man with old records, Crane said. Land law has evolved. To whose benefit? Clara said. Everyone looked at her. She kept her eyes on Crane. You've diverted water from this property for 3 years, she said. Ethan built a new water source to compensate for what you've taken, and now you're filing a claim on the source he built. In a court 4 counties away in front of a judge you can afford. She tilted her head slightly. What is it you're actually after, Mr. Crane? Because this seems like a considerable amount of effort for a 40-foot strip of mountain land. Crane looked at her with the expression of a man who does not enjoy being spoken to this way by a woman young enough to be his daughter, and who is considering how to respond to it. The water, he said after a moment. It came out before he could dress it up raw and plain. The spring feeds my lower pasture. Your channel draws from the same source. I don't intend to share it. The yard went quiet. He had said it. Right out in the open, with Gerald Holt standing 4 feet away and 2 legal representatives present, he had simply said the plain truth of it, because he was accustomed to saying plain truths and having the world arrange itself accordingly. Clara looked at Gerald Holt. Holt was looking at the ground. You knew, she said. About the diversion. You knew when you wrote the letter about the boundary survey. You knew he was going to claim the channel. Holt raised his eyes. He met hers. He had the decency, she thought, to look uncomfortable, which was not much, but was something. The arrangement I made, he said carefully, was for Ethan's benefit as much as— Don't, Ethan said. His voice had gone very quiet. Don't do that, Gerald. Holt stopped. You put a clause in my marriage contract that lets you reinstate Clara's debt, Ethan said. You wrote to me about the boundary survey instead of filing an objection, and now you're standing in my yard next to the man who's been stealing my water for 3 years. He looked at his uncle with an expression that was not anger, but its colder, more settled cousin. What exactly were you going to get out of this if it went the way Crane planned? Holt's face went through several things. There are business arrangements. Between you and Crane, Ethan said. Ethan. How long? Ethan said. The silence that followed was answer enough. Clara felt something cold settle through her. Not fear. Something harder than fear. Understanding arriving late, but arriving fully of the shape of what had been built around them, the debt, the marriage, the letter, the survey, the Laramie judge. It had not been random. It had been arranged. You needed me up here, Ethan said slowly. Not just for the land. You needed me occupied, settled, with a wife, with a household, with things to lose. Holt said nothing. Because a man alone on a mountain who doesn't care about anything is harder to threaten, Ethan said. You gave me something to lose before you told me what it was going to cost me. Clara looked at Ethan. He was looking at Holt with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not rage, not grief. Betrayal, clean and sharp, and without any of the self-deception that usually softened it. Is that true? Clara asked Holt directly. Is that what this is? Gerald Holt was a man who believed debts should be paid, and the world ran on contracts. He had said so himself. And there was a particular version of honest that such a man occasionally displayed, not conscience exactly, but the inability to maintain a lie when the lie was standing right in front of him fully assembled. The ranch is worth more than Ethan thinks it is, Holt said at last quietly. The timber rights alone, and the water if it's properly managed. Crane and I have been developing a plan for the valley, a larger operation. He looked at Ethan. I had intended to bring you in, at some point. After you'd taken the pieces you needed, Ethan said. I planned to compensate. Get off my land, Gerald, Ethan said. His voice had not risen. It was the same quiet voice he'd used to tell Crane he wanted him off the property. It was the voice of a man who has decided something and will not be revisiting the decision. Holt opened his mouth. He closed it. He put on his hat with the manner of a man who is deeply uncomfortable and has no available exit that doesn't cost him dignity. The court order still stands, Crane said, because Crane was not Gerald Holt and did not feel the same discomfort. Whatever you think of the personal elements of this situation, the legal matter requires your compliance. We'll comply with what's legally required, Clara said. And we'll file our response with Pettifer's documentation within the week. She looked at Crane steadily. And when we do, I think you'll find the case considerably less settled than it looks right now. Crane looked at her, then he looked at Ethan. Your wife has opinions, Crane said. My wife, Ethan said, is right. He said it simply without performance, without looking at Clara for reaction. He said it the way he said things that were plainly true. Clara felt it go through her like the cold water from the upper spring, clean and real and bracing. The four men left. The yard went quiet. Chess, who had been sitting at the porch steps with the focused watchfulness of a dog who understood the tenor of things, even if not the content, relaxed and lay down. Ethan stood on the porch with the papers in his hands and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, I have to go to Laramie. When? Clara asked. As soon as I can arrange it. He looked at the papers. It's a 4-day ride. I'll need to find someone who can stay. I'll be here, Clara said. Clara, I can't leave you alone on the... You can, she said. I've managed harder things than a week alone on a working ranch. She looked at him steadily. Go to Laramie. Take Pettifer's records. Find a lawyer who isn't Crane's lawyer. I'll be here when you get back. He looked at her for a long time with that particular look, the one she'd been watching change in increments so small you could miss them day to day, but couldn't miss them across 11 weeks. The one that had started as assessment and had become over time something she didn't have a word for that fit correctly. You're not afraid, he said. Not a question. I'm afraid of plenty of things, she said. This isn't one of them. He was quiet for another moment. Pettifer's going to need a signed affidavit from me, he said, describing the diversion, how I documented it when I noticed it. Write it tonight, she said. I'll copy it clean for you. My hand is steadier than yours. He looked at her. Your hand is steadier than mine, he repeated slowly. For writing, she said. For most things you're steadier than anyone I've met. But your hand shakes slightly when you're angry, and you've been angry since you saw those men in the yard. She paused. Anyone would be. Something in his expression cracked open. He sat down on the porch steps suddenly like the weight of the morning had decided to collect all at once. He put the papers on his knees and his elbows on the papers and his face in his hands, and he sat like that for a moment. Clara sat down beside him. She didn't say anything. She didn't offer comfort in words because she had learned that he didn't receive comfort in words the way some people did. He received it in presence, in steadiness, in the particular reassurance of not being alone with a hard thing. So she sat beside him on the porch steps in the September morning with Chess at their feet, and the mountains on 3 sides, and the papers on his knees. And she was simply there. After a while he lifted his head. Gerald raised me, he said, after my parents died. He wasn't warm, but I thought he was honest. Maybe he was, Clara said. Once. People change for money. It's the most common story there is. It doesn't make it... He stopped. No, she said. It doesn't. He looked at the mountain across the yard. He looked at his hands. I'm going to fight this, he said. I know, she said. Even if it costs... He paused. It might cost more than the land is worth. Some things are worth more than what they cost, she said. He turned his head and looked at her close, and she was aware of how close they were sitting, and she was aware that she had sat down beside him without thinking about it, without calculating, and she was aware that he was looking at her in a way that was different from any of the ways he'd looked at her before, not assessing, not recalibrating, not working to contain something, just looking. Clara, he said. Yes, she said. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked back at the mountain. Thank you, he said, for all of it, since the beginning. She looked at her hands in her lap. Don't thank me yet, she said quietly. We haven't won. No, he agreed. But we haven't lost either. He stood up. He put his hat on. He held out his hand to help her up, which he had not done since the first day in the paddock when Opal had deposited her in the dust. She took it. He held it a fraction of a second longer than was necessary. Then he let go and went inside to start writing, and Clara stood on the porch in the September morning and put her hand against her own sternum for a moment, feeling the particular weight of something that was shifting. Had been shifting, she understood now for weeks, into something she did not have a name for yet, but that she was increasingly certain she was going to need one. Ethan left for Laramie on a Wednesday before the sun was fully up. Clara stood in the yard and watched him pack the saddlebag with the affidavit she'd copied clean the night before Pettifer's survey documentation rolled and wrapped in oilcloth against the weather, and 3 days' worth of dried provisions that she'd put together without being asked. He'd checked everything twice, the way he checked everything twice, methodical, unhurried, and then he'd looked at her across Drum's back with an expression she was still learning to read in all its variations. "The mare in stall 2 is running a slight fever," he said. "I checked her this morning. She'll need—" "I'll check her twice a day," Clara said. "I know what to look for. The east gate latch needs lifting before you push, otherwise it sticks, and—" "Ethan," she said. He stopped. "I've been running this ranch alongside you for 11 weeks, she said. "I know the gate. I know the mare. I know where the spare lamp oil is and how much corn the horses get, and that Chess won't eat if you put his bowl too close to the water trough." She looked at him steadily. "Go." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat, settled it on his head, and swung up into the saddle in a single movement. "4 days, he said. "Maybe 5. "I'll be here," she said. He touched the brim of his hat, that automatic gesture she'd come to know as well as her own heartbeat, and turned Drum toward the mountain road. Chess moved to follow, and Ethan said, "Stay." And Chess sat down beside Clara, with the dignified resignation of a dog who had received clear instructions and intended to follow them. Clara watched until Ethan was over the first ridge and out of sight. Then she looked down at Chess. "All right," she said. "It's just us." Chess put his chin on her boot. "Don't look at me like that," she said. "I'm fine." She was fine. She was almost fine. She turned back to the house and went to work. The first day was straightforward. She had a routine now, the kind of routine that had built itself over 11 weeks, the way water builds channels, finding the path of least resistance and then deepening it until it was simply the way things went. Morning fire coffee animals, garden breakfast, whatever the day's work required. The work required in Ethan's absence a bit more than usual, and she was tired by evening, and the tiredness was honest, and she didn't mind it. It was the evening that was the hard part. She had not anticipated the quiet. She had lived alone before. After her father died, there had been 8 months of genuine solitude in the small house she couldn't afford to keep, and she had managed it. She was not a woman who required constant company. But this quiet was different from that quiet, and it took her until she was sitting at the kitchen table after supper, with the lamp turned low, before she understood why. The silence here had over 11 weeks become a shared thing. Even when neither of them talked, and they spent large portions of each day not talking, there had been the sound of him in it. Boots on the porch, the back door, movement in the barn, the occasional low exchange with Chess. The house had held 2 people's silences, and that was different, she understood now, from one person's silence. Emptier, larger in the wrong direction. She went to bed at a reasonable hour and did not sleep well, and in the morning she got up and lit the fire and did not let herself think about it. On the second day, the fever mare got worse. Not dramatically worse, not crisis worse, but worse enough that Clara moved her to the smaller isolation stall, changed her water twice, and spent 2 hours in the evening going through what she knew and what she'd seen and what Ethan would do. She had watched him deal with a sick animal once early in her time on the mountain, and she'd paid close attention the way she paid close attention to everything useful. She did what needed doing. The mare, her name was Pepper, a name Clara thought didn't suit her at all. She seemed more like a violet, sweated and fretted, and finally toward midnight settled. Clara sat with her until she was sure the settling was the right kind, and then she went back to the house and washed her hands, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and thought Ethan would have known faster than I did what to do. But I did it. And she's all right. She wrote it down in the small notebook she'd started keeping, ranch notes. Things she'd learned, things that needed doing. She'd started it in the 3rd week and hadn't mentioned it to Ethan, and then he'd found it on the kitchen table one evening and read the first page before she'd come back into the room, and he'd set it down and said, "The north fence gate, you put that under fixed, but it still needs the post properly, set." And she'd said, "I put it under temporarily fixed, needs post. Read more carefully." And he'd turned the page and read more carefully and said, which was his version of being corrected gracefully. She missed him in a way that was inconvenient and uncomplicated, and she sat with it at the kitchen table and let herself acknowledge it, because pretending things weren't true had never served her. Then she went to bed and slept better than she had the first night. The letter arrived on the 4th day, carried up by the boy who'd been making the weekly mail run. 2 letters, actually, one from Pettifer, addressed to both of them, which she opened because Pettifer had been corresponding with both of them for weeks, and she had as much right to it as anyone. The second was addressed only to her in handwriting she didn't recognize. She read Pettifer's letter first. He had heard from the Laramie court. Crane's filing had been received and a hearing date had been set for the 22nd of October. 6 weeks. Pettifer had also on his own initiative reached out to a land attorney in Laramie, a man named Beaumont, who Pettifer described as competent and not yet purchased by anyone, and Beaumont had agreed to review the documentation. Pettifer was cautiously optimistic, which from Pettifer was approximately equivalent to anyone else waving a flag. She put the letter down and picked up the second one. The return address was Harrow Creek. The handwriting was labored, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone for whom writing did not come naturally, but who was making a deliberate effort. She unfolded it. It was from a man named Carl Briggs. She did not know the name, but the letter explained it. He was a rancher who ran cattle on the valley's eastern edgeland that bordered Crane's property to the south. He had heard through Pettifer, apparently, that Ethan Blackwood was contesting Crane's boundary claim. He wanted Ethan to know that he had experienced a similar boundary dispute with Crane 4 years ago, had settled because he couldn't afford the fight, and that the terms of his settlement had included a non-disclosure he was technically violating by writing this letter. He was willing to testify if it came to that. "I settled because I was alone," the letter said in its careful, labored hand. "You've got more than I did. Use it." Clara read this twice. She folded it carefully and put it in the notebook with Pettifer's letter, and she sat for a moment in the afternoon quiet of the kitchen. "You've got more than I did. A wife. A woman who copies affidavits clean and argues with Aldous Crane on her own porch, and knows when a mare is running fever and stays up until midnight to make sure the settling is the right kind." She did not say this out loud, because there was no one to say it to. But she felt it, the specific sensation of being something to someone, of being the thing that made a difference, rather than the thing that needed managing. It was not a feeling she had much experience with, and it fit her imperfectly, like a dress made for someone of the same general shape, but not her exact measurements. She was still working out how to wear it when she heard drum on the road. She was in the yard when Ethan came through the gate, and she knew before he dismounted that it wasn't bad news. Not because he looked happy. Ethan Blackwood's face was not built for the transparent display of happiness, but because the particular set of his shoulders was different from the tense control she'd seen when the 4 men rode into the yard. He was tired, road tired, but underneath the tiredness was something resolved. "Well," she said before he'd finished swinging down. "Beaumont took the case," he said. "He's good. He went through Pettifer's documents in front of me, and he got angry, which Pettifer says is what he does when he thinks something's genuinely unjust." "A lawyer who gets angry about injustice," Clara said. "Rare. Rarer than it should be." He handed her drum's reins, a gesture that was automatic now, the easy division of labor that had developed between them, and pulled the saddlebag down. Crane's survey, Beaumont spent 2 hours with it. He found the issue. The surveyor Crane hired mislabeled a landmark. The big granite outcrop on the north boundary, Crane's survey calls it a different rock than the one Pettifer's original used. They're measuring from 2 different points. Which means the measurements don't even start from the same place, Clara said. Which means the claim falls apart the minute anyone checks it against the terrain. He looked at her. You understood that immediately. It's basic geometry, she said. Two measurements from different starting points will never agree. Beaumont used almost exactly those words, Ethan said. He paused. He asked if you'd be willing to submit a written account of the conversation in the yard, when Crane admitted the water was what he was actually after. His exact words as you heard them. She'd been expecting something like this. She'd written down what Crane said within 2 hours of the men leaving the property while it was fresh and the page was in the notebook. I have it written already, she said. He looked at her. I wrote it down that afternoon, she said. Verbatim as close as I could get, with the date and who was present. He was quiet for a moment. You knew we'd need it. I thought we might, she said. Go seat a drum. I'll have food ready when you come back. He didn't move immediately. He was looking at her with that expression, the one that had started as assessment and had been changing increment by increment since the morning she'd lit the fire before he was up, since the paddock dust and the water channel and the lamplight in Bess's stall. Only now it wasn't changing anymore. It had arrived somewhere. Pepper's better, she said, because she needed to say something ordinary. The fever broke on the second night. I know, he said. The boy told me when I passed through town. He said you moved her to the isolation stall. She needed the quiet. She gets anxious in that stall usually, he said. She doesn't like being separated. She didn't like being sick more, Clara said. She settled once she understood I wasn't going anywhere. Something moved through his expression. Yeah, he said softly. Some creatures are like that. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned and led Drum toward the barn, and Clara stood in the yard and pressed the back of her hand briefly against her own cheek and found it warm. She went to start supper. Tug. She showed him Carl Briggs's letter over the meal. He read it twice the way he read everything that mattered. He set it down and looked at the table, and she could see him thinking through what it meant, not just legally, but the fuller weight of it. Another man who Crane had done this to. Another piece of land, another water source, another arrangement that had looked like business and turned out to be taking. How many more do you think there are? She asked. Enough, he said. Crane's been building for 20 years. He doesn't do it loudly. He does it in pieces, one at a time, and he picks men who can't afford the fight. He paused. I almost couldn't. But you can, she said. Barely, he said. And then looking at her directly, not alone. She kept her eyes on her plate. Beaumont wants to know if we can find more people like Briggs, Ethan said. People who've settled with Crane under similar circumstances. If we can show a pattern, not just one boundary dispute, but a method, a way he operates, the case becomes something larger than just our north pasture. Pettifer would know, Clara said. He's recorded every deed in this county for 40 years. That's what Beaumont said. Have you written to Pettifer? I need to. He looked at her. I thought you're better at the letters than I am. This was she had come to understand Ethan's way of asking for something. Not requesting it outright, he was working on that, she thought, but it didn't come naturally, but acknowledging the other person's competence in a way that made it easy to offer. I'll draft it tonight, she said. You can read it in the morning and tell me what to change. I won't change anything, he said. You'll change something, she said. You always do. You find the one sentence that's slightly imprecise and you make it better. You have a good eye for precision. He looked genuinely caught off guard by this. I do. The water channel, she said. The affidavit. The way you check the fence line, you don't just check whether it's standing. You check whether it's standing at the right angle. You notice when things are slightly off. She picked up her coffee. It's a useful quality. He was quiet for a moment. My father was like that, he said. He used to say that most problems are small problems that nobody fixed when they were small. He measured everything twice. Smart man, Clara said. He was. Ethan agreed. A pause. He would have... He stopped. What? She asked. He would have been interested in you, Ethan said. He liked people who didn't need to be told things twice. He looked at his coffee. He only ever said that about 3 people in his life that I know of. Clara said nothing. She let it sit where he'd put it. One of them was my mother, Ethan said. The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the wood stove settled. Outside, chess shifted on the porch. Clara stood up and took their plates to the basin. She stood at the basin with her back to him for a moment, and she thought about fathers who measured twice, and mothers who didn't need telling twice, and a man who had spent 7 years on a mountain alone, and was apparently slowly becoming someone who said things like that out loud. Write the letter to Pettifer yourself, she said, not turning around. First draft. I'll clean it up after, but write it yourself. Why? He said. Because Pettifer respects you, she said. He's doing this partly because it's legally right, and partly because he wants to see you win. Your voice in that letter matters more than my precision. She turned around. I'll make it precise. You make it true. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. She handed him the pen. Pettifer's response came back within the week, and it came with names. 6 of them. 6 men in the county who had filed land disputes with Crane over the previous 15 years and settled every one of them before it reached a judge. 4 of them, when Ethan and Clara rode to see them over the following 2 weeks, were willing to talk. 2 of them were willing to put it in writing. One of them, a man named Henry Good, who ran sheep on the western edge of the valley and had the kind of quiet fury that builds over years of feeling wronged and having no recourse, had kept records. I kept everything, Good said, sitting across from them at his kitchen table. A man in his 60s with hands that had worked hard every day of his life and eyes that were still sharp with purpose. Every letter, every conversation I could write down after the fact. I kept it all because I thought someday someone would come and ask, and I wanted to be ready. He looked at both of them. I've been waiting 12 years. Clara felt something catch in her throat. Mr. Good, she said, what Crane took from you. What did it cost you? Good looked at her. He had the manner of a man who doesn't talk about costs, who has learned that talking about costs doesn't restore them, but he seemed to make a decision. My son had plans for that land, he said simply. The strip Crane took. My boy had drawn up plans for a small orchard. He was 17. He folded his hands on his records. He went to Colorado eventually. Better opportunities, he said. A pause. I think what he meant was, there wasn't enough left here to build something on. The room was very quiet. Ethan said, Give Beaumont everything you have. Every letter. Good nodded. I already boxed it up, he said. I boxed it up the day Pettifer wrote to me. I've been waiting for you to come ask. They rode back up the mountain in the early evening, and neither of them spoke much, but the silence had a texture to it. The texture of 2 people carrying something together that's heavier than it looks, and making the decision to keep carrying it. Finally, Clara said, His son. I know, Ethan said. Crane didn't just take land, she said. He took the future of it, what it could have become. That's what land is, Ethan said quietly. It's not just what it is. It's what you can make of it. She looked at him. That's what my father said, he added, when he deeded the ranch to me. He said it's not the acres, it's the years of work inside them. Clara thought about the kitchen garden and the water channel and June the filly taking her first steps in the stall. She thought about the notebook on the kitchen table and the bolt on the inside of her door that she hadn't used in weeks. We're going to win this, she said. It wasn't a question. It surprised her that it wasn't. Ethan glanced at her. You sound certain. Henry Good waited 12 years with a box of records, she said, because he believed someone would come and ask. That kind of faith doesn't exist if there's nothing to have faith in. She paused. We're not fighting for just us. We're fighting for his son's orchard. Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then he said, Clara. Yes, I want to tell you something, he said. He was looking at the road, not at her, and his voice had the particular quality it got when something was effortful. I want to tell you, and I want to tell you now, before the court case, and before whatever happens in October, because I don't want it to look like I don't want you to think it's about the case. She waited. When Gerald set this up, he said, I agreed to it because I told myself it was practical. A ranch needs two people. I needed someone who could hold things together. I told myself that was all I was looking for. He paused. The road went on ahead of them. That was true when I agreed. And then you came and it stopped being true, and I wasn't sure what to do with that. She kept her hands still in her lap. You made this place somewhere I want to come home to, he said. That's not something I expected. I didn't think I was going to want that again. I didn't think I was capable of it, maybe. His jaw moved. I thought that part of me was finished. Ethan, she said. I'm not asking anything, he said quickly. I know what this started as. I know you didn't choose this. I know. I stayed, she said. He stopped. I stayed, she said again steadily. There have been moments, ways, I could have gone. Written to Phyllis. Asked Pettifer. There were options. She looked at him. I didn't look for them. I stopped looking for them somewhere around the third week. He turned to look at her. The wagon had slowed because he'd let the reins go slack without noticing. The third week, he repeated. You taught me to ride, she said. And when I fell off, you laughed, and it was the first time I'd heard you laugh, and I thought... She paused. I thought, there he is. There's the actual man. His eyes were very dark in the evening light and very present. Clara, he said. I know what I'm saying, she said. I'm not confused about it. I'm not being practical. She held his gaze. I'm being honest. You told me something honest, so I'm telling you something honest back. He held the reins and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the horses moved at their patient, slow walk, and the mountains held everything in place the way they always did. I don't know how to... he started. You're doing fine, she said. Something in his face cracked open entirely, and she saw it, the full weight of 7 years of closed doors and managed distances coming loose in a single unguarded moment, and she didn't look away from it. He reached over and took her hand. Just that. Her hand in both of his, for a moment the rough warmth of a man who worked with his hands and had never been careful with them except when carefulness was exactly what was needed. Then he looked back at the road. He didn't let go. They rode the rest of the way up the mountain, like that, her hand in his, the evening going purple around them, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying that wasn't already being said. The 22nd of October arrived the way important days arrive, faster than expected, and carrying more weight than the calendar suggested. They rode to Harrow Creek the evening before and stayed at Phyllis Garrett's boarding house, which Phyllis had offered without being asked, and which Clara accepted without pretense. Phyllis, who knew everything, had clearly heard enough of the situation to greet Ethan with the particular warmth she reserved for people she had decided to approve of, which she communicated by pressing a substantial cold supper on him and telling him he looked better than she'd expected. You look like a man with something to live for, Phyllis told him with the bluntness that was her primary social mode. Ethan glanced at Clara. I am, he said. Phyllis looked between them with the expression of a woman who has understood an entire situation in 2 words and is satisfied with what she's understood. She excused herself to see to some fictional domestic matter and left them to eat. Clara looked at her plate. She was aware that she was trying not to smile and not entirely succeeding. She's not subtle, Ethan said. She's never been subtle a day in her life, Clara said. It's one of her best qualities. He almost smiled. Is it? She said what was true, Clara said, directly, without making you guess at it. She picked up her fork. I find that admirable. He was quiet for a moment. She said what you told her. I didn't tell her anything, Clara said. I wrote to her once a month. I wrote about the ranch and the horses and the water channel and Crane. I wrote about the legal case. She paused. She's intelligent. She assembled her own picture. And what picture did she assemble? Clara looked at him. Apparently an accurate one. He held her gaze. Apparently, he said, and the way he said it was soft and certain, and she felt it the way she felt the cold water from the spring, all the way through. The hearing room in Harrow Creek's courthouse was full. This surprised her. And then when she thought about it, didn't. A case against Aldous Crane, a man who had been operating in this valley for 20 years, taking things from people who couldn't fight back, was not a private matter. Word had traveled. The 6 ranchers Pettifer had identified were there, including Henry Good, with his 12-year-old box of records. Carl Briggs was there. People Clara didn't know were there sitting in rows, with the manner of people who have a stake in something and have decided to show up and make their stake visible. Beaumont was already at the respondents' table, reviewing documents with the focused intensity of a man who had been looking forward to this for 6 weeks. He was younger than Clara had imagined, from Pettifer's description, mid-30s, sharp-faced with ink stains on his right hand that she suspected were permanent. Crane was at the other table with his attorney, a smooth man from Laramie, who looked at the room with the mild disdain of someone who has been winning these cases for long enough to find them slightly boring. Gerald Holt was in the gallery, not at Crane's table. He had positioned himself in the 3rd row alone, and when Clara's eyes found him, he looked away. She found this information and put it aside to examine later. The judge was a woman. This was the thing that rippled through the room when she came in. Not shock, exactly in the way that men's shock tended to be, but the particular quality of attention that people pay when something unexpected has overturned their assumptions about the shape of an event. Judge Miriam Hale was perhaps 55 with gray at her temples, and the manner of a woman who had been dealing with men's surprised attention for long enough to find it mildly tiresome. She looked at the room. She looked at the 2 tables. She looked at the gallery with its unusual attendance. "It appears," she said dryly, "that Mr. Crane has provided the county with a community gathering." She opened the case file. "Let's begin." Clara sat beside Ethan in the gallery for the first hour and watched Beaumont work. He was better than she'd dared hope, methodical, precise, with a gift for making complex land law language sound like simple common sense, which she suspected was the thing that mattered most in a room full of people who were not lawyers. He laid out the 2 surveys. He laid out Pettifer's records. He called Pettifer to the stand, and Pettifer, who had testified before and was not impressed by courtrooms, explained in 40 years of professional authority exactly where Crane's survey had invented its starting point. Crane's attorney objected to various things. The judge overruled most of them with a brevity that suggested she had reviewed the documentation and formed opinions. Then Beaumont called Clara. She had known this was coming. Beaumont had told them the night before that her account of Crane's admission in the yard was the linchpin, not the only evidence, not even the most technically important, but the piece that made it human, that made the case something a room full of people could understand and care about. Her account, in her own words, of a man standing in someone else's yard and stating plainly that he wanted their water. She walked to the stand. She was aware of the room, the rows of faces, Ethan at the gallery's edge, Crane at his table, with his smooth Laramie attorney, Henry Good, with his 12-year-old box of records, and she was aware that her hands were completely steady. Beaumont asked her to describe the morning of September 4th. She described it. She described the 4 riders coming into the yard. She described Gerald Holt's manner, and Crane's manner, and the official with his papers. She described, in the careful verbatim language she had written down within 2 hours of the event, the moment Crane had answered her question about what he was actually after. "He said, 'The water,'" she told the court. "The spring feeds my lower pasture. Your channel draws from the same source. I don't intend to share it." The room was very quiet. "These were his exact words?" Beaumont asked. "They were," she said. "I wrote them down that afternoon. I've provided the written account to counsel." "And there were witnesses present?" "Gerald Holt, Ethan Blackwood, the official serving the papers, and one other man who rode with Crane," she said. "4 witnesses besides myself." Crane's attorney rose. The cross-examination was thorough and not unkind. He was too skilled for unkindness, which would have backfired in a room watching closely, but it was designed to suggest that memory was imperfect, that words could be misunderstood, that a woman who had arrived on the mountain 5 months ago as part of a debt settlement might have motivations that colored her account. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said pleasantly, "you came to Blackwood Ranch under fairly unusual circumstances, is that right?" "I came as Ethan Blackwood's wife," she said. "Under a debt arrangement," he said. "Your father's debt." "My husband's debt is paid," she said. "The marriage is legal and documented." "Of course," he said. "But you'd agree that your personal and financial security are tied to the outcome of this case." "My security," she said, and something in the word made her stop and reconsider it. "Mr. Langford, I came to this mountain with one dress and a bundle of personal effects and $340 worth of debt against my father's name. My security has never been tied to property or money. It's tied to my own 2 hands and my own word." She looked at him steadily. "If you're suggesting I would misrepresent what Aldous Crane said in my yard in front of 4 witnesses, I'd ask you to explain what version of my account could have served me better than the truth." The room stirred. The judge made a note. Langford moved on. Clara stepped down from the stand and walked back to the gallery and sat next to Ethan, and he did not say anything, but his hand found hers under the table and held it, and she felt the steadiness of his grip, and she thought, yes, that's right. That's what this is. But Beaumont called Henry Good last. Good walked to the stand with his 12-year-old box of records, and he set it on the edge of the stand, and he put his hands on it, and he looked at the room. He was not a man accustomed to courtrooms, but he was a man accustomed to knowing what he was talking about, and this made him more authoritative than most of Crane's attorney's objections could touch. He described what Crane had done to his land 12 years ago in the same methodical way he did everything date by date, letter by letter, the boundary dispute, and the settlement, and the strip of land his son had planned an orchard on. He described the non-disclosure agreement he'd signed. "You're aware," Langford said in cross-examination, "that testifying here may violate that agreement." "I'm aware," Good said. "And you're doing it anyway." "I am," said Good. "Why?" Good looked at him. He looked at the room. He looked at Clara and Ethan at the edge of the gallery. "Because my boy never got his orchard," he said, "and I'd like to make sure someone else gets theirs." The room did not stir this time. The room went the kind of still that happens when something true and irreducible has been said in a space that needed to hear it. Judge Hale looked at the room. She looked at both tables. "We'll recess for 2 hours," she said, "and then I'll give my ruling." The 2 hours were the longest Clara had spent in recent memory, and she had spent some long ones. They sat in Phyllis's boarding house around the kitchen table, she and Ethan and Pettifer and Beaumont, and eventually Carl Briggs, who had nowhere else to be, and was not the kind of man who could sit alone somewhere while something was being decided. Phyllis produced coffee and something that might have been pie under different circumstances, and was at least pie adjacent, and they talked about other things, the weather, the coming winter, the price of timber this year, with the mutual understanding of people who are all thinking about the same thing and have collectively agreed to give that thing room to breathe. At one point, Ethan went outside. Clara followed him without deliberating about it. He was standing in Phyllis's back garden with his hands in his pockets looking at the sky, and she stood beside him. "Gerald's in there," he said. She'd seen Holt come into the boarding house waiting room when they arrived. He'd sat down and not spoken to anyone, and no one had spoken to him. "I know," she said. "I don't know what he wants. I think he wants to know how it goes," she said. "And I think part of him might want it to go a certain way." She paused. "Not Crane's way." Ethan was quiet. "He raised me," he said for the second time in her hearing, and the words carried the same weight they'd carried the first time. He was never warm. But I didn't think he was capable of this." "People choose badly when there's enough money involved," Clara said. "It's not a surprise. It's still wrong." He looked at her. You can forgive someone and still know they were wrong, she said. Those aren't the same thing. No, he agreed. They're not. She looked at the sky. Whatever happens today, she said, we came here with the truth, all of it. Pettifer's records and Good's box and Crane's own words out of his own mouth. She turned to look at him. We didn't manufacture anything. We didn't buy anything. We came with what was actually true. And if it's not enough, he said, then we appeal, she said. And we find more people like Good, and we keep going. He turned to look at her fully. You wouldn't you? He said. Not a question. You'd just keep going. I'm a woman who counted minutes in a church to stop herself from running, she said. I don't stop easily. Something in his face moved into the open. Clara? He said. Yes, she said. He reached up and touched her face, his thumb against her cheek. Just there. Just for a moment, and looked at her with the full weight of everything that had shifted and built and become itself over the past 5 months. Whatever happens today, he said, I want you to know that what you said the 3rd week, me laughing in that paddock. He paused. That was the first time I'd laughed since Ruth. The first time it felt like something I was allowed to do again. Her throat was tight. You're allowed, she said. You've always been allowed. He lowered his hand. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then Beaumont appeared at the back door. She's called us back, he said. They went in. Judge Hale's ruling took 14 minutes to deliver and covered 6 different legal points, several of which Clara didn't fully follow, and Beaumont had to explain later. But the conclusion was plain enough. Crane's survey was found to be insufficiently documented to supersede the county's existing recorded boundary, which would remain as Pettifer's original survey described it. The boundary claim was denied. The water channel built on Blackwood land remained on Blackwood land. Furthermore, given the testimony regarding the water diversion, Crane's admission corroborated by witnesses, the court found sufficient grounds for a separate action regarding unlawful diversion of a natural water source to be filed if the affected party chose to pursue it. Langford was already whispering in Crane's ear when the gavel came down. Henry Good sat in his seat for a moment before standing up, and he put his hand on the box of records, and he looked at it, and Clara, watching him from across the room, saw the exact moment when 12 years of waiting became something he could set down. She turned to Ethan. He was looking at her. We won, she said. We won, he agreed. He stood up. He pulled her to her feet, and he held her hands in both of his, right there in the middle of the clearing courtroom, with Pettifer shaking Beaumont's hand and Briggs slapping someone on the back, and Good quietly rearranging his records in his box. What do you want to do? Ethan asked her. His voice was low for her. Go home, she said without hesitation. The word sat between them, home, and it fit the way it hadn't when she'd first arrived, the way it had grown to fit over 5 months of fire lighting and fence setting and water channel building and a filly named June, and a dog who followed her everywhere, and a man who laughed when she fell off a horse. Home, he agreed. And when Gerald Holt appeared at the courtroom door and stood there hat in hand, looking at Ethan, with an expression Clara had no simple word for regret maybe, and the particular discomfort of a man who has understood something too late but has understood it. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, Come to supper, Sunday. Come up the mountain. Holt blinked. There are things to say, Ethan said. We'll say them, but not today. Holt nodded. He put his hat back on. He left without speaking. Clara looked at Ethan. That was generous, she said. He raised me, Ethan said simply. Badly and imperfectly, and with his own interests too much in the picture. But he raised me. He paused. You said you can forgive someone and know they were wrong at the same time. I did say that, she said. Seems like a reasonable approach, he said. She looked at him. This man who didn't say things until he'd thought them all the way through, who measured twice and questioned things that didn't sit level, who had been closed for 7 years and was now visibly undeniably open, and she thought, there he is. There's the actual man. She had thought that in the paddock covered in dust the first time she heard him laugh. She was still right. They rode home in the late afternoon, the mountain road climbing steady beneath them, and the world felt different in the way it feels different after something large has been decided. Not louder, not brighter, but more itself. More settled into its own shape. Clara sat beside Ethan on the wagon seat and felt the particular quiet of two people who have been through something together and come out the other side, still standing, still, side by side. Chess was waiting at the gate when they came through, as he always was, and he greeted Clara first, pressing his great gray head against her hand, and then Ethan, and then turned and led them both toward the house, as if the matter of welcome was entirely under his management. He always does that, Ethan said. Greets you first. He has good judgment, Clara said. Ethan looked at her sideways. He does. He agreed, and the way he said it had nothing to do with the dog. She went inside to start the fire, while he took Drum to the barn, and she stood in the kitchen of the house that had been hers for 5 months now, and let herself feel it the win. The court goods face when the gavel came down, Ethan's hands holding hers in the middle of the clearing room. All of it sitting in her chest like something warm and solid and real. She had not let herself feel it in the courtroom. She had been practical in the courtroom, had kept her hands steady and her voice level and her mind on what was needed. But here alone in the kitchen, with the fire starting to catch, she let it arrive fully. They had won. She put the kettle on. She leaned against the counter and pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed. They had won, and the water channel was theirs, and the north pasture was theirs, and Henry Good could tell his son, wherever he was in Colorado, that it had mattered the box of records the 12 years of waiting. That someone had come and asked. Ethan came in when she was pouring the coffee. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The fire was going, and the kettle had just boiled, and Chess had arranged himself in front of the wood stove, with the expression of a dog who considered this entire outcome personally satisfying, and the house held all of it without straining. Sit down, she said. You've been on a horse for 4 days, and on your feet in a courtroom all morning. He sat down. She put coffee in front of him. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the table. Beaumont wants to pursue the diversion claim, he said. Separate case. Against Crane for the 3 years of water he diverted. Will it hold? Beaumont thinks so. He paused. Crane's attorney came to him after the ruling, made a quiet offer. Crane settles the diversion claim privately, a sum of money paid directly in exchange for no further legal action. Clara sat down. How much? Ethan told her. She was quiet for a moment. It was a real sum, the kind of sum that could do things. Repair the barn properly, expand the herd, put aside something for a winter that turned bad. It was not a small offer, and Crane knew it wasn't small, which meant Crane was genuinely worried about what a second case would look like with Good's records in front of a judge who'd already ruled against him once. What do you want to do? She asked. I want to know what you think, he said. She looked at him. This was also new, not in the last 5 months, but in the last few weeks, this particular way he had of asking. Not deferring, not surrendering the decision, but genuinely wanting the other perspective before he formed his own conclusion. Take the settlement, she said. Use the money for good. He stared at her. For good. Part of it, she said. The strip he lost 12 years ago, Crane still owns it. But the money could help him start something on what he has. His son might come home if there was something to come home to. The silence that followed was the thinking kind. She let it run. The rest, she said, barn roof. You've been patching it since March. He put his elbows on the table. He looked at his coffee. He looked at her. You know what nobody has ever done, he said. What? Suggested giving away part of a legal settlement. He paused. Before the settlement was even accepted. Good gave us 12 years of records, she said. He got up on that stand and violated a legal agreement to do it. He did it because we asked. We owe him something. We don't, Ethan said. Legally. Ethically, maybe, but... Then ethically, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat back. All right, he said. You agree. I've been agreeing with you for 5 months, he said, with the almost smile she had learned to read like weather. I don't know why you keep sounding surprised. She felt something bright move through her chest. She hid it in her coffee. The Sunday supper with Gerald Holt arrived before she felt ready for it, the way important things tended to arrive. She had made more food than 3 people needed. Not from nervousness, she told herself, from practicality. There was always more to do with food than less. And the table was set with the good plates she'd found in the back of the kitchen cabinet 2 months ago, and polished on a day she was working out something difficult and needed her hands busy. Ethan had said very little about the upcoming meal. He had gone about the week's work as he always did, methodical and thorough, and she had watched him and understood that he was processing something privately before he was ready to process it out loud. And she gave him the space for that, because that was who he was. And she had learned that the space was not distance. It was how he arrived. Holt rode up on a horse that was too fine for a man coming to apologize, which Clara noted, and then decided was not her concern. He came onto the porch and took off his hat, and held it in both hands, and he looked at the house the way a man looks at a place he's been before, and which has in the intervening time become something different. It looks well, he said. The place. It is well, Ethan said. Holt's eyes moved to Clara. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he said, Mrs. Blackwood? Mr. Holt, she said. Come inside. She fed them both, and she sat at the table, and she let them talk without managing it, without steering, because that was not her conversation to manage. She was Ethan's wife, and this was Ethan's table, and the business between these 2 men was decades older than anything she was part of, and the best thing she could do was be present without being in the way. Holt said partway through the meal, I didn't think Crane would push it this far. Ethan looked at him. That's not an excuse, Holt said quickly. I know what I did. I knew about the diversion, and I didn't tell you. I wrote you a letter designed to make you think the boundary issue was separate from... He stopped. It wasn't separate. No, Ethan said. I made a calculation, Holt said. I told myself you'd be compensated eventually, that the arrangement was going to benefit everyone. You told yourself what you needed to tell yourself, Ethan said. Holt was quiet. You're not a dishonest man, Ethan said. That's what makes it worse. Dishonest men expect themselves to lie. You talked yourself into it. That's harder to undo. Holt set his fork down. He was not a man built for this, for sitting at a table and being told true things about himself without any available exit that wasn't cowardice. He sat in it. What can I do? He said finally. Ethan looked at him. Tell me about the timber rights, he said. You said the ranch was worth more than I knew. Tell me what you know. Holt blinked. He had clearly expected something else, punishment perhaps, or a longer reckoning. What he got instead was a man who had decided to move forward and wanted information to move forward with. The northern timber, Holt said slowly. There's a logging operation interested in the county. They've been buying rights quietly. Your acreage, the pitch pine and spruce up in the high range, it's exactly what they're looking for. How long have you known this? 2 years, Holt said. Ethan was very still for a moment. Then he said, Write me the names of the people in the logging operation. Everything you know about them. Ethan, you owe me that much, Ethan said, not harshly, just plainly. Write me the names. Holt wrote them. He produced a small notebook from his coat pocket and wrote 3 names in his careful hand and tore the page out and put it on the table. Clara looked at the page. She looked at Ethan. He picked it up. He folded it. He put it in his shirt pocket. All right, he said. Holt looked at him with the expression of a man waiting for a door to close. I'll need time, Ethan said, before things are as they were. I don't know if they'll be as they were, but come back in the spring. He paused. Bring Margaret. Margaret was Holt's wife, who Clara had met once at the wedding, and who had spent the entire reception looking at her husband with the expression of a woman who suspected something and hadn't yet decided what to do with the suspicion. Clara had thought at the time that Margaret Holt was considerably more perceptive than her husband. "Margaret will want to come," Holt said quietly. She likes Clara." "She doesn't know me," Clara said. "She said you were the kind of woman who looked at a situation and saw what it actually was," Holt said. "She said it after the wedding. She said it like she meant it as a compliment." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Tell her thank you," she said, "and tell her spring is a good time. The garden will be worth seeing." Holt left an hour later, and the house held the particular quiet of a difficult thing that has been faced and is now at least faced. Ethan sat at the table for a while after. Clara cleared and washed and let him sit. "All right?" she asked when she was done. "Yes," he said. And then, "No. But I will be." "That's honest," she said. "I learned that from someone," he said. She hung the dish towel. She turned around and looked at him at the table, and he was looking at her the way he'd been looking at her since the courtroom, since her hand in his on the wagon seat, since the back garden of Phyllis Garrett's boarding house when he'd touched her face. "There's something I need to ask you," he said. Her heart did something she chose not to name immediately. "Ask," she said. He stood up. He was very tall in the kitchen in the lamplight, and he put his hands in his pockets the way he did when he was working out how to say something that mattered. "The arrangement," he said. "The way this started. The debt and Gerald's letter, and none of it was what I'd have chosen if I'd had the choosing of it." "I know," she said. "What I'm asking," he said, "is whether you'd have chosen it, if it had been a choice." He looked at her steadily. "If you'd met me not like this, not the way we met, if you'd met me somewhere ordinary and had a real choice in front of you." A pause. "Would you have chosen this?" The question sat in the kitchen between them. She thought about it the way it deserved to be thought about. Not quickly, not to give him what he needed to hear, but actually. She thought about the man she'd seen at the altar in 11 minutes of counted vows, the man who had put wildflowers in a blue jug and told her the door had a bolt on the inside. She thought about the paddock, and the water channel, and a foal named June, and a dog who followed her everywhere, and Good's box of records, and a courtroom, and her hand in his on the wagon seat. "Yes," she said. "I would have. It might have taken longer." She held his gaze. "But yes." He breathed. "I'm not the easiest person," he said. "No," she agreed. "You think before you speak, and you go quiet when something's hard, and you work through problems alone before you'll ask for help, and you've spent 7 years building walls that are now inconvenient." She paused. "I know." "And," he said, "and I'm a woman who counted minutes in a church, who learned to build water channels and copy affidavits and argue with Aldous Crane in her own yard," she said. "I'm not looking for easy. I never was." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, and he kissed her. Not carefully, not tentatively. The way a man kisses someone when he's done being afraid to, when the thing that's been building for 5 months has run out of room to be anything but itself. She kissed him back. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, and his hands were on her face, and she could feel him breathing, and she thought, this is what it was building toward. All of it. From the church to the mountain, to the wildflowers in the blue jug, to this kitchen, this moment, this man. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you," he said with the particular simplicity of a man who has thought about a thing long enough that saying it comes out plain and whole, no decoration needed. She pulled back just enough to look at him. "I know," she said again. And then, "I love you too," in case that wasn't clear. Something happened in his face that she had no word for and didn't need one. It was complete. "It was becoming clear," he said. "Becoming?" she said. "You're not subtle," he said, "when you're paying attention." She laughed, a real one, sudden and unguarded, and he smiled, the full version, the one that changed his face entirely, the one she had been watching arrive since a paddock in July and a rabbit and a mouthful of dust. Chess from in front of the wood stove made a sound of supreme satisfaction and put his chin back on his paws. The winter came hard that year, the way Wyoming winters came without apology and without preparation time. It arrived in November with 2 feet of snow and a cold that made the windows run with ice on the inside, and the ranch pulled inward on itself the way all living things do in winter, tending to what was closest burning, what was necessary making the warmth last. Clara had known cold winters. She had not known winters that looked like this one. She and Ethan worked the ranch together through November and December with the efficiency of 2 people who had spent 5 months learning each other's rhythms until the rhythms were shared almost unconscious. She knew which tasks he preferred and which he'd hand off without needing to be asked. He knew when she was thinking hard and needed quiet, and when she was going to need to talk it through. They had built something between them that was, she thought, better than either of them would have built alone. Not because they filled each other's gaps exactly, but because they made each other's strengths more useful. In December, a letter came from Beaumont. Crane had accepted the diversion settlement. The sum was in a Harrow Creek bank account in both their names. Ethan showed her the letter at breakfast. "Both names," she said. "That's how I asked Beaumont to set it up," he said. She looked at the letter. "You did that before the settlement was accepted." "I did it before we went to court," he said. "I asked him to set up the account before we even left for Laramie." He picked up his coffee. "I figured whatever came out of it was ours, both of us." She looked at him. "You were already certain," she said, "before the ruling." "I was certain we were right," he said. "Courts don't always agree with right, but either way." He put the cup down. "Either way, whatever came out of it was ours." She folded the letter carefully. "We need to write to Good," she said. "I wrote to him yesterday," Ethan said. "I sent the letter down with the boy." "What did you say?" "I told him the settlement came through and that we wanted to talk to him about the use of a portion of it. I told him his son was welcome on this mountain any time he wanted to look at what a man can build when someone's in his corner." He paused. "I may have said it slightly differently than that, but that was the meaning." Clara set down the letter and looked at her hands on the table and let herself feel the full weight of this, the money and the letter and the bank account in both their names, and a man who had written to Good yesterday before she'd asked, because he'd already understood it was the right thing. "Ethan," she said. "I know," he said, gently. She nodded once. She picked up her coffee. She looked at the window where the snow was coming down again, the particular relentless white of Wyoming in December. "The barn roof," she said. "Spring," he said. "Soon as the ground thaws." "And the south pasture fence." "Also spring." "And I want to expand the kitchen garden," she said. "Double it. If we're going to have people up here regularly, Good and his son Gerald and Margaret in the spring, we'll need more." "People up here regularly," Ethan repeated slowly. "Is that all right?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "2 years ago," he said, "I came off this mountain 4 times a year and didn't speak to anyone I didn't have to." He looked at the window. "And now you're planning a social calendar." "A modest one," she said. "Very modest. 2 families, possibly 3. "Possibly 3, he said. "Carl Briggs's wife sent a letter," Clara said. "She would like to visit in February. She raises chickens, and she has opinions about a breed she thinks would do well up here. She wants to discuss it." "She wants to discuss chickens," Ethan said. "At length, I suspect," Clara said. "Based on the letter." He looked at the ceiling briefly with the expression of a man revising his expectations of the next several decades. Then he looked at her. "All right," he said. "You're going to have a social life," she told him pleasantly. "I married a woman who talks to people," he said. "You married a woman who used to wash their laundry," she said. "It was always going to lead here." And there it was, the full smile, sudden and complete, the one that transformed his face, and she felt it in her chest, like the first cold water from the upper spring, like the foal standing on new legs, like all the best things that announce themselves without apology.
真的 such.
January brought a stillness that was different from any other stillness Clara had experienced, the particular hush of a mountain winter where even the wind seemed to decide the effort wasn't worth it. They were snowed in for 11 days in the middle of the month, and the world reduced itself to the house and the barn, and the short distance between them, and this was, she discovered, not a hardship. They read in the evenings. Ethan had more books than she'd expected. She'd found them in a trunk in the spare room, carried up from somewhere, read in the years of solitude and put away. They read separately and occasionally aloud to each other when something struck one of them as worth sharing. She read him passages from a history of the Spanish land grants in California that she found fascinating and he found interesting in a measured way. He read her something from a natural history of the mountain ranges that she found interesting and he found fascinating, and the difference in their emphases made for a running conversation that stretched across 3 weeks and half a dozen books. "You're better read than you let on," she told him on a Tuesday evening in January, with the snow against the windows and the fire very present. "Most people don't ask," he said. "Most people probably didn't give you room to say," she said. He looked up from his book. "No," he said. "They didn't." She looked back at hers. "Your father had all these books?" she asked. "Some. The rest I bought, 1 or 2 a year when I went down to the larger towns." He turned a page. "Reading seemed like something I could still—" He stopped. "After Ruth," she said gently. "After Ruth," he agreed. "Books don't require anything from you. They just exist when you need them." She understood this. She had read every scrap of written material she could get her hands on since she was a child, for exactly the same reason. "What did she like to read?" Clara asked. He was quiet for a moment. She waited, knowing now that his silences were not deflections, but processing, knowing the difference between a silence that meant, "Don't ask that," and a silence that meant, "Let me find the right words." "Poetry," he said. "She liked poetry, which I couldn't follow half the time. She'd read me something and I'd say I didn't understand it, and she'd explain it, and I still didn't understand it, and she thought that was the funniest thing." The roughness was there in his voice, the grief and affection braid, but it was softer now than it had been when he'd told her in the clearing. She had a whole shelf of it. I kept the shelf. Where? He looked up. Something crossed his face, not reluctance, but a kind of careful offering. "Back room," he said. "The trunk." "The trunk with the history books. Under them," he said. She thought about this. The books on top, the poetry underneath. The thing he could still reach for, and the thing he'd put below it to keep safe. "Can I see?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said. She went to the back room. She opened the trunk and moved the history books aside, and there they were, a small collection, 6 volumes worn in the particular way of books that have been read many times. She picked up the one on top, a slim volume, and opened it to a page that fell open easily, the page of a poem that had been read dozens of times. She read it standing at the trunk in the January cold. It was about light. About the way light arrived in the morning and what it meant to wake up and find it still there, still arriving the way it always had. She read it twice, and then she put it carefully back and went back to the main room. Ethan was watching the fire. "She had good taste," Clara said. "Better than mine," he said. "Different than yours," she said. "Not better." He looked at her. "Read me one sometime," she said. "When you want to." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was very quiet and very open. "All right," he said. She picked up her history book. He picked up his. Outside the snow fell. Inside the fire held. The letter from Good's son came in February. His name was Thomas, and he wrote the way his father talked, directly, without ornament, every sentence earning its place. He was in Denver. He was 29 years old. He had been working in lumber, which he found he had mixed feelings about, he said, given what he now understood about his father's land. He thanked Ethan and Clara for what they'd done. He said his father had written to him the night after the ruling, and that the letter had arrived on a Tuesday, and he'd sat with it for 3 days before he could write back. At the end of the letter, he said he was thinking about coming home. "Not sure what home looks like now," he wrote. "But Dad seems to think it's worth finding out." He mentioned an orchard. "I haven't stopped thinking about it." Clara read this at the kitchen table, and did not try to keep the feeling from her face because there was no one to keep it from. Ethan was in the barn, and so she sat alone in the February kitchen and let herself feel the full, complete, irreducible rightness of it. Thomas Good and his orchard, 12 years and a box of records and a winter morning in a Wyoming courtroom. What a thing it was! What a thing! She was still at the table when Ethan came in stomping snow off his boots at the door, and he looked at her face and stopped. "What happened?" he said. She handed him the letter. He read it standing in the doorway with his coat still on and his hat still on and the cold still coming off him. She watched his face as he read. When he looked up, his expression was the open one, the unguarded one, the one she had come to know as well as she knew her own. "He's coming home," Ethan said. "He's thinking about it," she said. "He's coming," Ethan said. There was no doubt in his voice. She smiled. "Probably," she agreed. He folded the letter. He put it on the table. He took off his hat and hung it on the hook and came and sat down across from her, and they sat at the kitchen table in the February morning, with snow outside every window and Chess asleep in front of the stove, and she thought, "Look at this. Look at what this is." "Ethan," she said. "Yeah, I need to tell you something." He looked at her. Something in her tone made him sit forward slightly. Not alarm, but the full attention he gave to things that mattered. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what comes next, for the ranch, not just this year, further than that." "Tell me," he said. "The timber rights," she said. "The logging operation Holt mentioned. I've been reading about it, what logging does to mountain land long term. The runoff, the erosion, what it does to water sources." She held his gaze. "I don't think we should sell those rights, even if the offer is significant." "No," he said immediately. She looked at him. "You already decided that. Before you said it," he said. "My father, he used to say the land was a trust, not a commodity." He paused. "I've been thinking about what else it could be. The timber, without logging it." "Managed access," she said. He looked at her. "That's the phrase Beaumont used when I asked him about alternatives." "It's the right phrase," she said. "You allow limited access for specific purposes. Research possibly under terms you control. The land stays intact. You generate income without depleting what generates it." He was quiet in the thinking way. "Beaumont could help structure it," she said. "He seems to like problems with legal complexity." "He does," Ethan agreed. "It's unsettling how much he likes them." "He's good at them," she said. "That's what matters." Ethan looked at his hands on the table. "This is a long plan," he said. "Longer than one season." "Yes," she said. "It's a plan for—" He stopped. He looked up. "For a long time here." "Yes," she said again steadily. He held her gaze. "I want that," he said. "I want that very much." "I know," she said. "So do I." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The fire in the wood stove settled. Chess made a small sound of dreaming contentment. Outside, the February snow was beginning to ease, and somewhere in the quality of the light through the window there was the first faint suggestion of something that was not quite spring yet, but was no longer entirely winter. Spring arrived in increments the way it always does at altitude, not a single arrival, but a series of negotiations between cold and warmth, each one shifting the balance a little further, until one morning you woke up and the balance had tipped, and everything felt different without anything looking dramatically changed. Henry Good came up the mountain on the first real spring morning, and he came with his son. Thomas Good was tall and had his father's careful eyes and his mother's jawline from the photograph Henry had shown them once. He shook Ethan's hand in the yard, and he looked at the mountains on three sides, and he breathed in the spring air, and Clara watched his face, and saw the exact moment, when something inside him understood what his father had been keeping safe for 12 years. It's something, Thomas said, looking out. It is, Ethan said. Dad says there's a place on the south-facing slope that would do for an orchard. There is, Ethan said. Good soil, gets the morning sun, protected from the worst of the wind. He paused. Come look at it. The three men walked toward the south slope, and Clara stood in the yard with Chess and watched them go, and she thought about an orchard that hadn't existed yet, and a young man who had come home, and a father who had kept a box of records for 12 years because he believed someone would come and ask. She went to the kitchen. She started the noon meal. She put on the good coffee because there were people coming for a meal, and she did this. Now, she realized, made the good coffee when people came, and it had been months since it had felt like anything other than the natural and obvious thing to do. Gerald and Margaret Holt arrived mid-morning, as agreed, and Margaret Holt was exactly what Clara had sensed at the wedding. A perceptive woman who had spent years married to a complicated man and had developed in the process a finely calibrated understanding of complicated situations. She came into the kitchen and looked around, and then looked at Clara with a directness that Clara recognized as kinship. You've made this place something, Margaret said. Not as a compliment exactly, as an observation the way a person states something they can see plainly. We have, Clara said. Both of us. Margaret nodded once. He needed that, she said, and she meant Ethan and Clara understood this and didn't require elaboration. I think I did too, Clara said. Margaret looked at her for a moment, and then she smiled, the first full smile Clara had seen from her, and it was a good one, the kind that had warmth and sharpness both. I brought seedlings, Margaret said. From my garden in town. I didn't know if you'd want them, but I thought I'd bring them. What kind? Clara asked. Columbine, Margaret said. Yellow and purple. Clara stood very still for a moment. The blue jug, the first day, the flowers that had been picked that morning and were still fresh. I'd love them, she said. Margaret put them on the table wrapped in damp cloth, and they stood looking at each other in the kitchen of the house that had been impossible and was now home, and Clara thought, look how far this has come. Look how far all of this has come. The afternoon was the kind that arrived in the mountains, sometimes in early spring, unexpectedly warm, with a particular quality of light that was gold and clean, and made everything it touched look more like itself. They ate on the porch, all of them, the Goods, the Holts, Ethan and Clara, and the meal was loud, in a way that the ranch had never been loud before, full of overlapping conversations, and Thomas Good asking Ethan questions about the North Timber, and Henry Good telling Margaret Holt something about his wife's recipe that she disagreed with enthusiastically, and Gerald Holt being slightly quieter than everyone else in the manner of a man who was understanding slowly what he had nearly cost himself. Clara sat beside Ethan and watched it all and let it be what it was. At one point, Ethan leaned over and said very quietly, "Is this the modest social calendar?" "This is the modest social calendar," she confirmed. "It's loud," he said. "Is that all right?" He looked at the table full of people, Good and his son the Holts. Chess inserting himself hopefully between chairs, the mountain on 3 sides and the spring light on all of it. "Yes," he said. Simply, completely. She put her hand on his on the table. He turned his hand over and held hers. That evening, when everyone had gone and the dishes were done and the house had settled back into its own quiet, Ethan went to the back room. Clara heard him in there for a few minutes, and then he came back to the main room with one of the slim poetry volumes from the trunk. He sat down across from her at the table. He opened it to the page that fell open easily, the poem about light, the one she had read standing in the cold of the back room in January. He read it to her. His voice was not a performer's voice. It was his voice, low and careful and a little rough at the edges, and he read the poem the way he said important things, without decoration, letting the words be what they were. She listened. When he finished, he closed the book and set it on the table and looked at her. "Well," he said. "She was right," Clara said. "It's about light. It's about light coming back," he said. "After dark." "Yes," she said. He looked at the table. I couldn't read it for a long time, he said. After she died, I'd open the book to that page, and I couldn't. He touched the cover with one finger. I can now. She understood what he was saying. She understood all of it. Read me another one, she said. He looked up. Something in his expression was the most open she had ever seen it. The doors not just cracked, but standing wide, everything visible and unafraid. He opened the book. He read her another poem, and then another. Outside, the spring dark settled over the mountains, and the horses moved in the barn, and June, 5 months old, now steady on her legs, and certain of her place, made a sound that carried through the still air. And Chess arranged himself between their chairs in perfect satisfaction, and the lamp burned, and Ethan's voice continued in the quiet room, reading words that were old and true, and Clara sat with her hands folded and her eyes closed, and thought here. This is it. This is what it was all building toward. Not the court, not the water channel, not even the moment he'd kissed her in the kitchen. This, a lamp, and a table, and a man she loved, reading her poetry in the voice that was only his voice, in a house that had been impossible and was now so entirely unmistakably home that she couldn't remember anymore what home had felt like before it. She had come up this mountain with nothing but a straight spine and a jaw that didn't tremble. She had not needed anything else. She had built everything else, and this was the end of the building. This ordinary evening, this lamplight, this voice. The two of them choosing each other as freely and completely as two people ever had, in a place that held them both, without straining at the foot of mountains that had been standing long before either of them arrived, and would be standing long after. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.